Chapter 812. Through Taoist priest Tianhua's explanation, Luo Fan also learned that the person who used hundreds of thousands of galaxies as a testing ground was a powerful being at the peak of the Khanate Zenith Heaven realm. His name was Longzuan. Text first, Longzuan was a golden immortal realm cultivator that belonged to the era of cultivation over 3 billion years ago, and he cultivated in the Golden Core realm as well. The Golden Core he attained was flawless and leakless, and it was even to the extent that he was only a step away from becoming a saint of legend. According to the cultivation knowledge that Luo Fan obtained from the Great Tianyuan world, Longzun's cultivation realm was at least at the level of a transcendent or even a supreme being at the level of a Tao master. Such an existence was considered a peak existence even in the Great Tianyuan world. He was already qualified to step onto the path of becoming a sage. Such an existence treated hundreds of thousands of galaxies as a testing ground. In these hundreds of thousands of galaxies, it nurtured trillions of planets and creatures whose numbers couldn't even describe the specific number to test all kinds of possibilities and verify all kinds of ideas. That was simply extremely natural. There was nothing unimaginable about it. For countless years, cultivators as powerful as Longzuan in this universe might be like carps crossing the river. As Luo Fan thought about this, he suddenly felt a sense of fascination. It's a pity that the Earth universe, which had such a foundation, ended up in such a state in the end. It produced the era chaos, which cleansed the entire universe generation by generation, making it impossible for the Earth universe to grow into a big world. After a moment of reminiscence, a deep sense of helplessness arose from the bottom of his heart. As his cultivation realm increased, he became more and more convinced that his previous conjecture about the Earth universe was correct. Although what Luo Fan entered the Earth universe was only a clone of himself, and his body was still in the untainted world, compared to the Great Tianyuan world and even the untainted world, his feelings for the Earth universe were deeper. After all, he was born in the Earth universe. To him, the Earth universe was like his home. It was like home. Although at this moment, there was almost nothing in the entire Earth universe that he was familiar with, as a mortal, home was home. Regarding this place, his feelings were still different from other places. Under such circumstances, how could he not feel helpless when he found out that the Earth's universe had such a good foundation to survive the great tribulation of heaven and earth, and yet the world had become so broken for some reason? This helpless thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind from time to time, but he did not say it out loud. These feelings were not something he could share with Taoist priest Heavenly Fire at the moment. Time gradually passed as Taoist Skyfire explained to Luo Fan the general knowledge and history of Earth and the universe. After who knew how long, Taoist Heavenfire suddenly stopped talking to Luo Fan. He said, "Another fellow Taoist has arrived. Fellow Taoist, please wait for a moment and bring me to welcome him." Luo Fan smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, just go ahead." Taoist Skyfire smiled apologetically, turned around, and disappeared in front of Luo Fan. At the same time, Luo Fan could faintly feel two auras pass through the dimensional realm and appear within it. One of the auras was very familiar to Luo Fan. It was the aura of Taoist Skyfire's incarnation, who had brought him across countless light years to the star. As for the other aura, it contained a perfect ice frost intent. It was also a Khanate Grand Luo existence, and its strength and cultivation seemed to be a little stronger than Luo Fan's incarnation. However, it was only a little. If they were to fight, Luo Fan had absolute confidence that he could suppress Luo Fan's incarnation. Luo Fan's incarnation cultivated the legacy of the Herculean Tao Lord. Just by relying on the legacy alone, it could compare to a 6th-level immortal in the great heaven primordial world. Coupled with its cultivation realm, it was not a gap that could be closed even if it was just a little stronger than Luo Fan. Suddenly, Luo Fan had a thought, and a faint smile appeared on his face. So, it's another incarnation. It seems that those who can cultivate to the Khanate Grand Luo in the harsh environment of the Earth cosmos are not lacking in caution. After entering the dimensional realm, the aura that seemed to be Taoist Skyfire's incarnation dissipated with a loud bang. It blended into the dimensional realm. Taoist Skyfire's aura also appeared next to that aura, as if he was saying something. After a while, Taoist Skyfire led a strong man in a tight suit over through the air and appeared on the flat ground. The strong man was 12 feet tall, and his body exuded a power that could shake everything. As he moved, the surrounding void distorted slightly, as if it could not withstand his power. When the brawny man saw Luo Fan, he was surprised at first, but when he took a closer look, he instantly became solemn. Under the guidance of Taoist priest Heaven Flame, the brawny man came to where Luo Fan was. Seeing this, Luo Fan also stood up. As the host, Taoist Skyfire naturally had to introduce him. After some introductions, Luo Fan learned that the strong man was called Martial Emperor and that he had the highest martial arts in the universe. This time, he was invited by Taoist Skyfire's incarnation for the same reason as Luo Fan, to discuss something important. Greetings, fellow Taoist. I see that the power around you is condensing, and it seems that you're also walking the path of martial arts. Why don't you and I have a spar? The Martial Emperor said after exchanging pleasantries with Luo Fan. Taoist Skyfire's eyes lit up when he heard the Martial Emperor's words. That's great. I haven't seen the Martial Emperor in action for a long time. I'll have a good look today. When Luo Fan saw Taoist Skyfire's appearance, he instantly recalled the various things that happened when he met Taoist Skyfire's incarnation and could not help but laugh. Taoist Skyfire was clearly a battle maniac. He had not mentioned it before because it was difficult for him to. Now that the Martial Emperor had taken the initiative to ask for a spar, it was exactly what he wanted, and he naturally wanted to facilitate it. If it was possible, he might even want to join in. I don't cultivate the path of martial arts, but the path of strength. If you want to see my martial arts cultivation, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed, Luo Fan said with a smile. Haha, fellow Taoist, don't be modest. The connection between strength and martial arts is incomparably close. If you walk the path of strength, how can your martial arts cultivation be low? Skyfire, hurry up and take out your treasure. Aren't you afraid that we'll destroy your cave dwelling? The Martial Emperor laughed and shouted as he pulled Luo Fan's hand. Looking at his fanatical expression, Luo Fan knew that he had to fight even if he had to. He had to fight even if he didn't want to. However, in reality, he was not against it. Just as the martial monarch had said before, the relationship between strength and martial arts was incomparably close. The cultivation of martial arts required great strength to be able to display its might, and the cultivation of strength and martial arts were also not the best, but they were still an excellent method to display their might. Therefore, when he found out that the Martial Emperor had the title of the supreme martial arts in the universe on Earth, he was also very tempted. He wanted to see what the supreme martial arts looked like. He also wanted to comprehend some profound martial arts principles from this martial monarch so that he could better display his strength as a clone. It'll be done soon. It'll be done soon. You can't fight here. This poor Taoist cave dwelling can't withstand the two of you. Taoist priest Skyfire said hurriedly. As he spoke, he quickly led the Martial Emperor and Luo Fan to the front of a building at the side. The building was made of wood and had a Taoist charm. However, this charm added a bit of iron-blooded aura. Taoist priest Skyfire raised his hand and drew in the air. A mysterious wave instantly seeped into the building in front of him, causing the iron-blooded aura in the building to increase violently. After a while, the door of the building suddenly opened, revealing a land under the starry sky. Among so many fellow Taoists apart from me, only a battle maniac like you would specially open up a place like this for fighting. The Martial Emperor looked at the land under the starry sky in front of him and looked at Taoist priest Skyfire with a sympathetic gaze. Taoist priest Skyfire laughed and didn't say anything. He just impatiently pulled the Martial Emperor and Luo Fan into the land under the starry sky. As soon as they entered, Luo Fan was slightly shocked. He found that the surrounding space was many times more stable than the outside world. Even the ground beneath them was countless times harder than the ground outside. Even the vast thousand worlds couldn't compare to it. When Luo Fan saw the strength of the space and the land, he had a direct understanding of Taoist priest Skyfire's desire for battle. If the effort and materials used to open up this battlefield were used in the outside world, I fear that the outside world would no longer be a vast thousand worlds. This battlefield was only 10,000 miles in radius. Compared to the outside world, it was countless times smaller. Even if the strength of the space and the land were stronger than that of the vast thousand worlds, the amount of effort and materials required was not something that the outside world could compare to. It could be said that the cost of a battlefield with a radius of 10,000 miles was comparable to that of 100-dimensional worlds. With such a difference in costs, how could Taoist priest Skyfire not see the difference between this battlefield and the outside world? After the three of them entered, Taoist priest Skyfire closed the door behind him. They seemed to appear in the boundless universe. Aside from the specks of starlight around them, there was only the land that supported them. Although Taoist priest Skyfire was fanatical, he still noticed Luo Fan's expression and said with some regret, "What a pity. With my cultivation, I can only strengthen the battlefield to such a degree. The area is only 10,000 miles in radius. It's not easy to fight. This strength is countless times stronger than the starry sky outside. Fighting here is already countless times more comfortable than the outside world. It's hundreds of times stronger than my battlefield. What are you dissatisfied with?" The martial emperor said with a displeased expression. Hearing the martial emperor's sour words, Luo Fan finally understood what kind of existences the two in front of him were. He couldn't help but wonder if he had made a huge mistake by being dragged in. All right. Enough with the idle chatter. Let's have an appetizer." Taoist priest Skyfire laughed. Luo Fan shrugged, but didn't say anything in objection. Since he had already entered, could he return? The martial monarch was overjoyed. After warning Luo Fan to be careful, he ignored the heavenly flame and raised his hand to punch at Luo Fan. His movements seemed to be extremely simple and crude, but they contained extremely profound martial arts principles. Every single muscle in his arm vibrated, every single movement of his body, and every single movement of his body conformed to some sort of supreme principle. It drew on an infinite and powerful force, and it even caused the surrounding space to crack, densely covering an area of tens of meters. Luo Fan saw this punch. Zhang Xian's eyes lit up. In fact, the strength contained within this punch wasn't very formidable. At most, it was equivalent to the strength of someone who had just attained the innate golden immortal realm. Such strength was 1,000 times weaker than the strongest strength that Luo Fan and the martial monarch could exert at this moment. Obviously, this was only a test from the martial monarch. However, even if this punch was only a test, Luo Fan could tell that the martial monarch's cultivation in the Tao of martial arts had already reached the acme of perfection. Although it was a simple punch, it contained countless profound martial arts principles, and it contained profound might that was sufficient to allow living beings who didn't know anything about martial arts to step onto the path of martial arts. Of course, such a punch was obviously not a problem for Luo Fan. Although Luo Fan hadn't wholeheartedly cultivated martial arts, there were countless profound martial arts techniques that Pangu had created based on his memories. Mysterious martial arts could be said to be innumerable, and with his wisdom, how could he not have learned anything about martial arts after cultivating for trillions of years? It could be said that Luo Fan's current cultivation and martial attainments were absolutely profound, even if he couldn't compare to a martial monarch. Even if it couldn't compare to the martial monarch, it wouldn't be too far off. Therefore, Luo Fan didn't hesitate at all when facing this punch. He raised his hand and threw a punch as well. His punch was not the same as the martial emperor's punch. This punch seemed to move in a spiral, and there were thousands of changes happening in the air at every moment. It drew on the boundless power in the air and collided with the martial emperor's fist. With a crack, a shocking rumble rang out. The space within a radius of several dozen feet was instantly crushed into powder by the shock waves from their punches. Nice! The martial monarch cried out in delight. After all, the The space had been specially refined by Taoist heavenly fire to be used as a battlefield, so it was naturally impossible for irreparable damage to be inflicted so easily. As a result, after the martial monarch's cry, the powder naturally fused together and formed a flat space once again. At this moment, Luo Fan and the martial monarch were entangled with each other, and they appeared in midair several tens of kilometers away from where they were. For Luo Fan and the martial monarch, that punch just now was just a test. Therefore, even if it turned the space into powder, even if the two punches were enough to cause space within a range of several tens of thousands of kilometers to collapse, they weren't affected at all. The two of them did not change their movements at all because of the punch. They were fighting crazily in the air several dozen kilometers away from where they were, at a speed that surpassed the imagination of ordinary living beings. At that moment, they were obviously no longer fighting directly with power like before. Instead, they pushed their cultivation in the Tao of martial arts to the limit, pushing every part of their bodies to the limit. Even the slightest change in their movements contained countless unfathomable mysteries. Every bit of power they unleashed contained a technique that could shock all cultivators. The martial monarch was worthy of being the supreme existence in the Tao of martial arts. His attainments in the Tao of martial arts had already reached a level that was close to the Tao of martial arts. If any of his movements were placed in the mortal world, they would be earth-shattering treasures that could guide countless cultivators to the path of immortality. Although Luo Fan's attainments in the Tao of martial arts were profound, he still couldn't compare to the martial monarch. As a result, he gradually fell into a disadvantageous position. Fortunately, Luo Fan's will clone was a body of power. The power in his body was close to the source of power. The might that every single bit of power could unleash was much stronger than the might of a martial emperor's power. As a result, even though his attainments in the Tao of martial arts were slightly inferior and he was at a disadvantage, he did not show any signs of being defeated. He continued to fight the martial monarch. Whatever damage the martial monarch dealt to him, he would retaliate in the same way, maintaining a rough balance in the battle. Apart from that, Luo Fan continuously absorbed the essence of the martial monarch's martial arts through his battle with the martial monarch. He constantly converted the martial arts the martial monarch had displayed into his own comprehension of the usage of power. His understanding of his own strength and his own body was constantly increasing. As his understanding increased, the power he could unleash became stronger and stronger, while the amount of power he needed to unleash the same power decreased. Of course, although this rate of increase was rather quick, it did not seem too obvious on the surface due to his extremely high attainments in the Tao of martial arts. It only made the martial monarch feel that the pressure Luo Fan exerted on him was increasing bit by bit in an extremely slow manner. Taoist Skyfire was extremely excited as he watched the battle. He stared at Luo Fan and the martial monarch, doing his best to remember every single detail of their battle. As his emotions changed, specks of flames gradually appeared on his body. The flames were faintly discernible, but they caused the surrounding temperature to gradually rise. Oh, it can't be. How can there be such a coincidence? Suddenly, Taoist Skyfire cried out in great pain. Chapter 8:13. The heaven-fired Taoist suddenly sensed that another clone of his was leading another Khanate Zenith realm cultivator across the barrier of the star and into this dimensional realm. First published just a few minutes ago, he had just welcomed a martial emperor. Now, after such a short period of time, another fellow Taoist had actually arrived. Compared to the process of waiting for his fellow Taoists to arrive for several years, this situation could not be any more coincidental than it was. Clearly, as the master of this dimensional realm and the existence who had invited his fellow Taoists here to discuss important matters, it was naturally impossible for him to continue watching the battle between Emperor Wu and Luo Fan when his fellow Taoists had arrived. This situation was simply bad news for the heaven-fire Taoist, whose desire for battle was beyond imagination. How could he not cry out in surprise? After he cried out, a look of struggle appeared on his face. After a while, he finally could not hold back his desire. With a single thought, countless flames emerged from his body, instantly condensing into a faint, slightly transparent, and somewhat illusory clone. This incarnation was far inferior to the two incarnations he had invited Luo Fan and Wu Huang to come here. Its power was so weak that it was almost like someone who had just reached the Gold Core realm. This kind of power was simply insignificant compared to the power of his body. Such a clone clearly had no combat strength at all. However, the Heaven Fire Taoist did not condense this clone for battle. After the clone was condensed, the Heaven Fire Taoist left it where it was and stared closely at the peerlessly brilliant battle between Luo Fan and Emperor Wu. Then, he turned around and gritted his teeth as he left the battlefield. Luo Fan and Wu Huang were already completely immersed in the battle. They did not care about Taoist Heaven Fire leaving behind an incarnation or his real body. In their senses, there was only the other party and only the various marvelous martial arts that the other party had displayed. Only the boundless principles that permeated the world existed. For ordinary people, the battlefield that spanned thousands of kilometers was enough for tens of millions of people to fight together, and they might not even be able to finish it. However, for two Khanate Zenith Realm cultivators like them, such a battlefield was still a little too narrow. Almost in an instant, their silhouettes almost covered the entire battlefield, causing the entire battlefield to be densely packed with their battle afterimages. In these battle afterimages, every posture, every movement, and every body shape contained the profound principles of martial arts. It contained the profound mysteries of martial arts that could allow all living beings to achieve the supreme path of immortality. It was precisely because of this that a martial emperor who condensed an innate golden core from cultivating martial arts and became an innate great Luo by condensing his strength in a martial arts through martial arts could be said to be the only one in the universe on Earth. One could imagine how lonely he was. With that, Luo Fan, who was a Khanate Grand Luo, had such an interest in martial arts. Although Luo Fan did not cultivate the Tao of martial arts, but the Tao of strength, Luo Fan could not help but feel as if he had met a bosom friend. Naturally, he welcomed the fact that Luo Fan had absorbed the principles of martial arts from him. As for whether Luo Fan would surpass him after absorbing the principles of martial arts, he was not worried at all. As a martial emperor and an innate great Luo realm being, he had supreme confidence in himself. He firmly believed that his strength did not come from his martial arts, but from himself, his spirit, his will, and his quality. If the principles of martial arts were absorbed by others, it would definitely not affect his strength. It was even more impossible for someone who was inferior to him to become stronger than him. With how sharp Luo Fan's senses were, when the martial emperor's response changed, he instantly noticed what the martial emperor was thinking. For a moment, he felt a little grateful. To Luo Fan, the importance of martial arts was only average. It was just a method for him to unleash his strength. It would naturally be good if he could cultivate it to the acme of perfection. Even if he could not, he had other methods to make up for such a loss. However, even if the importance of martial arts was average, the martial emperor's actions were a sign of goodwill to him. It meant that the martial emperor intended to help him. So how could he not appreciate it? After the Heavenly Fire Taoist left for a while, the door to the battlefield opened again. Then, the Heavenly Fire Taoist let a woman in. The woman was also a clone. Judging from the aura and the power contained within the clone, she had only just become an innate great Luo. It seemed like the woman's cultivation was slightly weaker than Luo Fan and the martial emperor. However, since she was an innate great Luo, since she was invited here by the Heavenly Fire Taoist, it meant that the woman was definitely not simple. During the process of cultivation, any cultivator's body would become more and more perfect as they were constantly tempered and improved. As such, it was almost impossible to find an ugly cultivator in the world of cultivation. Even if there were cultivators who did not seem to fit the aesthetic standards of ordinary people, if one took a closer look, One would also notice the various charms that made people feel good about them. Female cultivators were clearly more concerned about their appearance. As such, female cultivators in the world of cultivation were usually unimaginably beautiful. However, the woman who was lured here by the heavenly fire Taoist had broken this common sense. This woman's figure was quite beautiful, but her appearance was not flattering. It was not that she was ugly, but the woman's face was engraved with countless runes. Each of the runes was as small as a speck of dust. They were densely packed, and they were arranged on her face in an incredibly profound and complicated manner. It was as if a large patch of pitch-black spots had covered her face. No, it was not just her face. These tiny, dust-like runic roots not only covered his face, but they also extended downwards and covered his entire body. Her entire body was covered in countless black spots. Each of the huge number of runes contained various indescribable mysteries. When combined together, they formed an incredibly profound whole, making the woman's figure faintly discernible. It was as if she was communicating with time and space at all times. Vaguely, she seemed to be outside of time and space. It was as if she existed in the past, present, and future at the same time. The woman's expression was so calm that it was almost cold. As she stood there, she naturally gave off a transcendent aura. It was as if nothing in the world, including the living beings in the universe, could make her move at all. You've already met the martial emperor, so there's no need for introductions. Look at the fellow who's fighting the martial emperor. His name is Luo Fan, and he cultivates the path of strength. His abilities are extremely powerful, and even I'm not a match for him. Taoist Heavenly Fire introduced him to the woman with a chuckle. As he spoke, his eyes locked on a Luo Fan and the martial emperor, as if he was trying to engrave the scene of their battle deep in his memory, so that he would never forget it for the rest of his life. Fellow Luo Fan is only on par with you, the woman said indifferently. Taoist Heavenly Fire chuckled, but did not reply. He had known the woman for hundreds of millions of years, so how could he not know what kind of person she was? If he were to argue with her for not giving him any face, he would not be able to cultivate anymore. If he were to argue, he would waste all his time on that, and he would never have the time to cultivate again. Fellow Luo Fan's potential is greater than yours. Unlike you, I can't even see a trace of his future. A strange light flashed through the woman's eyes. As a space-time traveler, you're actually unable to see a person's future? Didn't you predict that I would face a certain tribulation in a few hundred years the moment you saw me? When he heard the woman's words, Taoist Heavenly Fire finally shifted his gaze away from Luo Fan and the martial emperor and turned to look at the woman in surprise. That's why I said your potential is inferior to his. The more powerful a cultivator's future is, the more difficult it is to see his future. Fellow Luo Fan is the cultivator whose future is the most difficult to see I've ever seen in my life. Perhaps his accomplishments in the future will be incomparably shocking. The strange light in the woman's eyes gradually faded, and a rare change finally appeared on her face. She sighed with emotion. Incomparably shocking accomplishments. Looks like I've invited a very impressive cultivator this time. Taoist Heavenly Fire chuckled. Taoist Heavenly Fire and the woman didn't disguise their conversation, but they weren't shouting or yelling either. Luo Fan and the martial emperor were wholeheartedly focused on each other and fighting each other. They didn't pay attention to anyone else, so they didn't notice their conversation at all. As a result, Luo Fan didn't know that the space-time traveler actually thought so highly of him. But even if he knew, he didn't care. After all, he had absolute confidence in himself. He believed that his future would never be shackled to the immortal realm, and that he would definitely be able to prove his origin Tao fruit and traverse the three perfect worlds. He would comprehend the cultivation civilizations of the three great worlds and cultivate the most powerful legacies of the three perfect worlds. If he still couldn't prove his origin Tao fruit, then he would definitely doubt its existence. As his battle with the martial emperor progressed, Luo Fan felt his will gradually change in some way, and the power within him was subtly adjusting as well. Luo Fan cultivated the legacy of Tao, sovereign of strength, and the power within him was a power that was close to the origin of all power. A power like that, it could be said that it was almost omnipotent. It could evolve into almost any substance that living beings could think of, and it could evolve into almost any power. Of course, when the word almost was removed, it would be the moment when the power truly became the origin of all power. Because of the characteristics of this power, Luo Fan was able to give it new characteristics at any time and place. He was able to fuse many of the characteristics of power that he had never obtained before into it, constantly making it approach the origin of all power. At that very moment, during his battle with the Martial Emperor, Luo Fan gradually sensed that there was a strange power entrenched in the Martial Emperor's body. That power was different from any power he had seen before. It was an unimaginable power that had been condensed from supreme will. This power was able to trigger a reaction from the power within him, causing it to gradually gain a quality that it had never possessed before. This quality made it easier and easier for him to use martial arts. It made his comprehension of martial arts faster and faster, and the growth of his attainments in martial arts became more and more astonishing. After an unknown amount of time, after exchanging countless attacks with the Martial Emperor, Luo Fan's mind suddenly jolted. It was as if a bolt of lightning had flashed through his mind. He instantly understood the power he had sensed from the Martial Emperor. Just what kind of power was the quality that the power within his body had gradually gained? It was martial power. It was a product condensed from the ultimate will of martial arts. It was a power that did not exist in the natural world and could only be found in living beings. After understanding this, Luo Fan was overjoyed. In that instant, he created what he had comprehended for who knew how many years. In this battle, the martial arts he had absorbed from the martial monarch's body were constantly being refined in his mind, continuously refining the true meaning of martial contained within. Then he crazily poured it into the power in his body that was akin to the source of power. The true meaning of martial arts was a mysterious existence that was invisible and intangible. If such an existence were to be placed in the hands of a cultivator who had completely immersed himself in martial arts, it would be enough to become the foundation of a martial arts worldview when extended. However, in the view of Luo Fan, in the view of Tao Master of Strength's worldview, it was only the quality of martial power. It was only a certain form of martial power. Therefore, in the process of continuously pouring the true meaning of martial arts into the power within his body, the power within his body gradually transformed and gradually became a kind of martial power that the martial emperor relied on to become a Khanate Grand Luo. This change instantly caused the aura that Luo Fan emitted to undergo some mysterious change. For ordinary cultivators, this change might be a very normal change. At most, they would think that it was a change in the method that Luo Fan used. However, for the martial emperor, this change brought him an unimaginable shock. This is martial. This is the aura of martial arts. Why does fellow Luo Fan have the aura of martial arts on him? At this moment, this was the only thought that appeared in the martial emperor's mind. With this thought, his body retreated slightly, and he instantly left the range of the martial arts that Luo Fan used. He directly left the battlefield. Of course, this was not a complete escape. If Luo Fan wanted to, he could easily chase after him and pull him back into the battle again. However, Luo Fan would not do this. After all, it was not a battle of life and death between him and the martial emperor. It was just a spar. The martial emperor's attitude had already indicated that he did not intend to continue the spar. How could he be so tactless and continue to chase after him? Moreover, at this moment, he had something more important to do than the spar with the martial emperor. It was to refine the true meaning of martial arts contained in the martial arts that he knew and integrate it into the power within his body so that he could truly grasp a completely new kind of power, martial power. He faintly had a feeling that as long as he grasped martial power, the inheritance of the great strength Tao lore that he cultivated would definitely be able to rise because of this. It would surpass the state when he had just broken through the barrier between immortal realm and mortal realm, and reached the second rank of immortal realm. In this way, perhaps the power of the divine ability that he cultivated from the inheritance of the great strength Tao Lord would be comparable to the peak of the ninth rank of immortal realm, which was close to the level of Khanate Grand Luo. At that time, coupled with the power of his will clone, the power that he could exert would definitely be even more powerful and shocking. Chapter 814. Just as Luo Fan and the Martial Emperor stopped and separated, the Skyfire Taoist and the space-time walker finally noticed the abnormality. They could not help but look at Luo Fan, who had clearly entered some sort of strange state, with a strange gaze. The Skyfire Taoist's eyes were filled with shock and envy, while the space-time walker's eyes were filled with a look as if he had seen a rare treasure. The reason why they had such a change in their minds was because at their current level of cultivation, if they wanted to have any sort of breakthrough comprehension, any sort of comprehension that could make them fall into a dazed state, it was practically something that could only be encountered once in a few tens of millions of years. At this very moment, Luo Fan, who was at the same level as them, had only fought with a martial monarch for a few hours before suddenly entering this wonderful state that they might only encounter once in tens of millions of years. How could they face this indifferently? Luo Fan stood there for several tens of millions of years. During these several tens of thousands of years, he was doing his best to fuse the true meaning of martialism from all the martial arts he knew into the power that was akin to the source of power in his body at all times. The entire process was extremely smooth. It was precisely because of this smoothness that he was able to completely extract the true meaning of martialism from all the martial arts he knew and fuse them into that power in just a few tens of thousands of years. At a certain moment after the several tens of thousands of years, Luo Fan completely fused the last bit of true meaning of martialism he had extracted into the power in his body. His power abruptly shook, and an indescribable aura of martialism instantly spread out. His aura also naturally changed along with the change in power. In that instant, it seemed to have turned into an incomparably pure martialism. He stood there like an emperor of martialism, a god of martialism. The surrounding space naturally changed along with the change. In that instant, endless information suddenly descended from the sky, continuously being generated from nothingness. It then suddenly poured into his body, completely fusing with the power in his body. Following this change, Luo Fan suddenly felt his body relax, as if he had broken through a faintly discernible barrier. He felt that his control over his power had deepened, and the power in his body seemed to have become closer to the source of power. When this change occurred, Luo Fan instantly understood that the inherited cultivation method of the Herculean Tao Master that he cultivated had already made a breakthrough and reached the second stage of the immortal realm. Although it was only a difference of one level for his strength above the inheritance method of Tao Master Hercules, it was not enough. It had risen by who knew how many times. With the power of the divine ability he had cultivated, he would be able to fight evenly with the primordial unity golden immortal of the untainted world, who was in the sixth stage of immortal realm. However, the increase in strength was only secondary. More importantly, with such an increase, his quality had taken a big step forward towards a source of power. He was one step closer to truly transforming his own power into the source of power and raising his cultivation realm to the highest peak. When Luo Fan's aura changed, the most shocked person was not the others, but the martial emperor standing not far in front of Luo Fan. A martial emperor's attainment in martial arts was so high that it had already reached a nearly pinnacle level. Compared to others, he understood how rare the aura exuded from Luo Fan's body was, and what it meant. Such a strong aura of martial arts. Without reaching the apex in the path of martial arts, without possessing an unimaginable understanding of the true intent of martial arts, without cultivating martial arts to the point of approaching the Grand Tao, without cultivating martial arts to the point of obtaining the acknowledgement of the universe, it would be impossible for it to exist. In the billions of years since he started cultivating until now, he'd never sensed such a strong aura of martial arts from any other living being besides himself. Even if it was a supreme existence at the peak of the innate golden immortal realm, he hadn't noticed a single cultivator that was capable of cultivating martial techniques to such an inconceivable state. An inexplicable excitement suddenly filled the martial emperor's mind. As his emotions changed, the way he looked at Luo Fan also gradually changed. It became fanatical. It became anticipation and joy. Among them, the strongest was an indescribable intimacy. At this moment, Luo Fan's position in his heart had surpassed all the people he had made friends with in his life. Luo Fan had already surpassed all the companions he had made in his life. Even Taoist Heaven Fire could not compare to Luo Fan in his heart. In other words, if Taoist Heaven Fire wanted to harm Luo Fan, he would definitely stand on Luo Fan's side. This change seemed sudden, but if one knew how much the martial emperor had sacrificed in order to promote martial arts and raise the status of martial arts, one would be able to understand why he had changed like this. Luo Fan did not notice the change in the martial emperor's mind. To him, the most important thing was the change in his body. It was to stabilize the cultivation realm he had just broken through. Everything else was secondary, and that naturally included the thoughts of the martial emperor. As his thoughts changed, the power in his body gradually changed. The power that had already been transformed into pure martial power gradually changed its nature. It gradually gained many mysterious and indescribable characteristics. The speed at which the characteristics increased was unimaginably fast. There were thousands of characteristics added to the power at almost every moment. After a few breaths of time, the martial power had completely transformed into the incomparably pure power that Luo Fan had cultivated through the inheritance of the great strength Tao Lord. It was incomparably close to the source of power. However, at this moment, this force had undergone an extremely subtle change compared to before. This kind of subtle change was something that no living being could clearly tell what it was. However, these changes had brought this power closer to the source of power. Along with this change in power, Luo Fan's aura also slowly changed, returning to its original state of being faintly discernible. This change was naturally noticed by the martial monarch, Taoist Heaven Fire, and the others. Taoist Heaven Fire and Time Walker both heaved a sigh of relief, while the martial emperor looked regretful. Both the Skyfire Taoist and the Space-Time Walker breathed a sigh of relief. Naturally, that was because they had regained their senses. The changes that happened to Luo Fan were still within their range of acceptance. He wasn't too monstrous or too unbelievable. The martial monarch's regret was even simpler. It was clearly because Luo Fan had no intention of maintaining his own path of martial arts, and only treated martial arts as a tool. This was naturally somewhat dissatisfying for someone like him, who treated martial arts as his everything. However, although he felt regretful, he did not feel the slightest bit of anger. After all, compared to other cultivators in the universe, Luo Fan, who could raise his attainments in martial arts to near the peak level, had a deeper understanding of martial arts than all the other cultivators in the universe except for himself. However, he did not demand too much. Like the martial monarch, he treated martial arts as his everything. Congratulations, fellow Luo Fan, on your great progress. The martial monarch cupped his fists and congratulated Luo Fan, who had opened his eyes. Thank you for your help, fellow. If you hadn't pointed it out, I would never have been able to achieve such progress. Luo Fan had already regained his senses. When he heard the martial monarch's words, he chuckled and cupped his fists in return. It's a pity. If you had concentrated on the path of martial arts, you would have been able to make martial arts flourish 100 times. Perhaps you would have been able to make martial arts separate from the path of the Golden Core and become a civilization of martial arts. The martial monarch said regretfully, "My path is the path of power. Although the path of martial arts is broad and deep and has the potential to become a civilization of martial arts, it is not my path. I have let you down." Luo Fan smiled. "It's a pity, The martial monarch continued to feel pity and did not say anything else. Luo Fan smiled faintly and did not say anything else. At this time, the Skyfire Taoist understood that Luo Fan and the martial monarch had no intention of sparring. He immediately brought the space-time walker forward and introduced him to Luo Fan. As for the martial monarch, he obviously already knew the space-time walker. Therefore, there was no need for the Skyfire Taoist to introduce him. After listening to the Skyfire Taoist's introduction, Luo Fan found out that the space-time walker was a title and not the woman's name. In fact, the woman was called the Space-Time Lady. She had also cultivated for billions of years. Although her cultivation level was much lower than everyone present, she had the ability to see through space-time. The past, the present, and the future had no boundaries in her eyes. Any cultivator who cultivated to the Khanate Grand Luo realm would definitely have the ability to divine. In other words, she could divine the past, the present, and the future. The Space-Time Walker and the Space-Time Lady's special ability seemed to be of little use. However, the truth was, the Space-Time Lady's special ability was many times stronger than the divination ability of ordinary cultivators. Ordinary cultivators couldn't calculate the past, present, and future of cultivators that were more powerful than them. However, this Empyrean Maiden's special ability allowed her to ignore the difference in strength. No matter how powerful a cultivator was, she could obtain a lot of future information that could only be calculated by existences that were more powerful than that cultivator. Unless the cultivator was like Luo Fan. He had unimaginable potential and had countless possibilities to transcend everything in the future. That was why she could not see anything. So the Space-Time Lady's ability is so powerful. My apologies. Luo Fan could not help but exclaim after learning that the Space-Time Lady had such an ability. You're too polite, fellow Luo Fan. You have an unimaginable future. I hope you'll be able to help me in the future. The Space-Time Lady's expression was still indifferent, but her expression was much richer than when she was facing the Skyfire Taoist and the martial monarch. She said to Luo Fan, the Skyfire Taoist and the martial monarch had known the Space-Time Lady for many years. The Space-Time Lady had always been indifferent to everyone, even to the point of being cold. They had never seen her treat someone like this before. For a moment, they could not help but cast sidelong glances at Luo Fan. They felt that Luo Fan was unfathomable. Luo Fan was slightly taken aback. He wondered if the Space-Time Lady had seen through him, and if she had seen through his future, but he did not ask. He only said, "You must be joking, fellow Space-Time Lady." Luo Fan had the heart of a powerful cultivator. He was not any less confident in himself than anyone else. With such a mentality, he would not be swayed by any external objects or other people's opinions. He would also not have the thought that he must know what she saw and adjust his actions according to what she saw, just because the air hostess before him might know about his future. To him, as long as he followed his heart, as long as he followed his own path, he would definitely be able to reach the peak, and he would definitely be able to transcend everything. Why would he need to place his hopes on the words of others? Seeing that Luo Fan had no intention of asking what she had seen, the space-time traveler's eyes flashed with a hint of light. It was obvious that he appreciated Luo Fan's will. However, since Luo Fan didn't intend to ask, she naturally wouldn't say it out loud, so she just faintly smiled. She could not help but smile faintly and change the topic. The Skyfire Taoist had already withdrawn his clone back into his body during the battle between Luo Fan and the martial monarch. Now that he had more or less familiarized himself with them, his desire for battle grew even stronger. He could not help but say, "Fellow Luo Fan, you've already fought with fellow martial monarch, but I haven't sparred with you yet. Why don't we spar again?" "Hee, fellow Skyfire, that's a little unfair. I'm here as a clone, while you're here as your main body. Can't we fight at all? Forget it." Luo Fan smiled. Don't. When Taoist priest Heaven Fire heard Luo Fan's evasions, he became anxious and shouted, "This poor Taoist can also use a doppelganger to exchange pointers with fellow Taoist. What kind of problem is this? How can I give up a chance to exchange pointers because of such a small problem? As he spoke, the Skyfire Taoist body shook, and a body walked out of his body. The body was completely condensed from flames. The flames were extremely condensed and powerful. The body that condensed was exactly the Skyfire Taoist's appearance. This was the aura that his body emitted. It was also many times stronger than the clone he condensed when Luo Fan and the Martial Monarch were fighting. However, the aura on his body was exactly the same as that on Luo Fan and the Martial Monarch. It was neither stronger nor weaker. Seeing that the Skyfire Taoist had even condensed a clone, Luo Fan could not help but be slightly stunned. He did not know whether to laugh or cry. Judging from a Skyfire Taoist's appearance, he had clearly planned this beforehand. Otherwise, how could it be so easy to condense such a clone with the combat power of an innate Grand Luo? Any innate Grand Luo cultivator had the ability to form a myriad of clones. However, while they could condense such clones at will, they were merely the projection of a thought. The combat power they possessed was rather limited. Compared to a clone that could be condensed at will, a clone with the combat power of an innate Grand Luo was completely different. It could only be achieved by condensing a huge amount of energy using a special method. Clearly, the Skyfire Taoist had condensed it naturally with just a thought. He must have made a lot of preparations beforehand and had already refined this clone. It was just that he kept it inside his own body. The Martial Monarch was not surprised by the Skyfire Taoist's eagerness at all. The Void Walker and the Sky Maiden were even more unmoved. They were much more familiar with the Skyfire Taoist than Luo Fan. How could they not know what kind of person the Skyfire Taoist was? If the Skyfire Taoist had not been so eager, they would have been surprised instead. All right, let's spar then. I hope you'll go easy on me. Luo Fan could only say that. The reason why he accepted the Skyfire Taoist's request to spar was not only because he wanted to show respect to the Skyfire Taoist, but more importantly, he had tasted the sweetness of victory in his battle with the Martial Monarch. He wanted to see if he could gain something from the Skyfire Taoist. Even if it was impossible for him to gain something like martial power that could directly increase his strength, it was still better than nothing. The Skyfire Taoist was even more delighted when he heard Luo Fan agree. With a thought, his clone arrived at the battlefield. However, his real body sat down cross-legged and slowly closed its eyes. Clearly, he planned to focus all his attention on his clone and wholeheartedly enjoy the upcoming spar. Luo Fan shook his head. Battle intent gradually rose within him, and he walked towards the Skyfire Taoist's clone. Before long, he was 300 meters away from the clone. Although the will of Luo Fan's thought doppelganger that cultivated the Herculean Tao Venerate's inheritance did not change because of the Herculean Tao Venerate's inheritance, but because of the characteristics of the Way of Power, it also stimulated the fighting spirit in the depths of his heart. As a result, the battle intent of his clone was not much weaker than the Martial Monarch and the Skyfire Taoist. Since he had already decided to fight, he naturally would not hesitate. Instead, he poured all his attention into it and wholeheartedly enjoyed the various benefits of this spar. Perhaps it was because they had seen through Luo Fan's true feelings that the Skyfire Taoist and the Martial Monarch spared no effort in wanting to spar with Luo Fan. They wanted to fight him. Otherwise, how could they be so overbearing when faced with a fellow cultivator who hated battle and loved peace so much that he would not fight to the death if he did not have to? How could they force him into a fight? It had to be known that it was extremely impolite. Be careful. The Skyfire Taoist shouted when he saw that Luo Fan had already stepped within 300 meters of him. He raised his hand and drew a circle. An extremely solid ring formed from flames instantly appeared. The power contained within the ring was boundless. As soon as it appeared, it caused the surrounding space to distort and deform from the heat. However, the heat was extremely restrained. Even though the surrounding space was already distorted from the heat, it did not increase the surrounding temperature at all. After the ring appeared, it abruptly shuddered and disappeared into the void. At the same time, Luo Fan suddenly felt a strong sense of danger around him, as if he had been trapped by something extremely sinister. Chapter 8:15. With a thought, a mysterious light seemed to flash through Luo Fan's eyes. He instantly used his power to see what was going on around him. As it turned out, at this very moment, the ring of flames had, at some point in time, enveloped him through some inconceivable method. Moreover, even after it enveloped him, the ring of flames did not appear. Instead, it fused with the void in an extremely mysterious way, as if it was changing the state of the void. This flame was an extremely mysterious space fire. It was a mysterious flame with spatial characteristics that could burn time and space, and it could destroy everything. This kind of flame could only be condensed by a cultivator who cultivated the path of fire to an unimaginable peak and expanded it to almost form a rudimentary view of the world. Only then could a cultivator condense a flame with spatial characteristics. If they took this a step further, they would be able to use flames to explain everything in the universe. This kind of flame had unimaginable power, but to Luo Fan, it was just ordinary. With a single thought, the force in his body was unleashed to its limit. He raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. His right hand drew a mysterious path, which seemed to contain countless martial principles that could only be explained in great books. Once it appeared, it would leave a deep mark in the void, attracting the attention of the people who were watching from the side. This mysterious path kept reverberating in their minds. With this path, Luo Fan's right hand easily drilled into the void. In an instant, it seemed to completely disappear, and it directly reached into the mysterious space where the space fire ring was. With a tremble, the endless heat contained in the space fire was pushed away like smoke, and he directly grabbed the space fire. The space fire ring was invisible and had no substance. It was a mysterious existence that had even fused with the void. Ordinary living beings would be burned into nothingness if they approached it, let alone grab it. Although his body seemed to be solid, it was still an empty existence in terms of quality. Without great magic and great power, it would be impossible for it to touch its body. However, at this moment, it was in Luo Fan's hand. The empty space fire, which contained endless power, was like an ordinary wooden ring. It was easily grabbed by Luo Fan. With another tug, the space fire ring left its original space and appeared in front of Luo Fan. Seeing this, Heaven Fire Taoist was not angry. Instead, he was delighted and shouted, "Good." Then, he raised his hand and made another circle. The space fire ring in Luo Fan's hand trembled slightly and collapsed in an instant. It broke free from Luo Fan's grasp and condensed into a fire dragon in front of Luo Fan. The fire dragon's scales were distinct and lifelike. There was even a faint, strange mist surrounding it. It vividly displayed the saying that the clouds came from the dragon and the wind from the tiger. After the fire dragon appeared, it frantically absorbed the boundless vitality in the air. The primal chi continued to fuse with the fire dragon, but did not directly grow the fire dragon. Instead, it was as if they were being used as fuel, constantly burning and producing all sorts of flames, causing the fire dragon to continuously expand due to the addition of these flames. In the blink of an eye, it grew from 10 feet long to 10 feet long. Its waist also became as thick as a water bucket. After growing to this size, the fire dragon still frantically absorbed the surrounding vitality. At the same time, it did not stop moving. Instead, it pounced at Luo Fan. Its body twisted and turned in the air, and its 5 claws drew mysterious trajectories. It swept up the surrounding space and crushed towards Luo Fan. During this process, the fire dragon became more and more corporeal due to the burning of the surrounding vitality. It became more and more like a body of flesh and blood. Almost at every instant, the power of the fire dragon was several times stronger than the previous instant. After a few moments, the power of the fire dragon was nearly twice as strong as before. At this time, Luo Fan was only a few feet tall. He was less than 10 feet tall, but he was at a disadvantage against the fire dragon that was 10 feet long and as thick as a water bucket. However, the aura around him was solid. There was a mystical aura that seemed to merge with some supreme existence in the world. It seemed like he was many times larger than the fire dragon. Faced with the fire dragon's extremely dangerous attacks, Luo Fan raised his hand and waved it slightly. In an instant, the air changed. The fire dragon's countless attacks seemed to hit him, but the various powers passed through and did not cause him any harm. Luo Fan had used the comprehension he had gained from a martial emperor to condense it into martial power. He had obtained a recognition of the great ways of the universe on Earth and was imbued with countless martial arts principles and the true meaning of martial arts. At that moment, his martial arts attainments were no lower than a martial emperor's. Of course, although his martial arts attainments were no lower than a martial emperor's, he did not specialize in martial arts. As such, if he used martial arts to fight a martial emperor, it would be difficult for him to defeat a martial emperor. On the other hand, martial arts were an extremely powerful method of unleashing power. With such martial arts attainments, he could create thousands of martial arts that were most suitable for him, as well as the situation he was currently in, out of thin air in an instant. Although only a few moments had passed since the fire dragon condensed and attacked him, he had already created thousands of martial arts that were suitable for him. However, in the process, he had already created thousands of martial arts suitable for the current situation. The one he chose was the one that consumed the least amount of energy and had the least movements. Of course, all these creations and selections weren't truly under his control. Having reached such an unbelievable level of martial arts attainments, he had long achieved the so-called returning to simplicity and fusing martial arts into his abilities. As such, the process of creating thousands of martial arts and choosing the most suitable martial arts happened within his abilities. In other words, he did not even need to think. As long as he faced such an attack, his mind would naturally come up with a way to deal with it. In reality, he had only chosen such a method after going through countless complicated changes within his abilities. In reality, such a martial art had only appeared for a split second when Luo Fan used it. Furthermore, Luo Fan had only used a portion of the martial art, a portion that was most suitable for the current situation and the state of Luo Fan's body. If he encountered the same situation the next time, the martial art that Luo Fan used might be completely different or even the exact opposite. The reason for this? Perhaps it was because of the subtle difference in Luo Fan's posture. Out of the thousands of martial arts that he had created to deal with the fire dragon's attack, any one of them would be treated as a grimoire by ordinary cultivators. However, these martial arts would not leave any trace in his memory. As long as he did not think about it and did not have the intention to take it out, it would be as if these martial arts did not exist at all. As long as he was willing, he could create countless such martial arts, and every one of them could be tailored to the physical and mental state of the living creature that he wanted to impart this martial art to. Only such a performance could be considered to have reached the acme of perfection in martial arts. Because such a performance, it meant that he had reached a state where he could do as he pleased with martial arts. To him, everything in the world was a martial art, and it was all the principles of martial arts. As long as he was willing, martial arts could be created endlessly, just like the legend of forgetting martial arts after obtaining them, and turning them into one's every move, using countless mysterious martial arts without any awareness of using them, the so-called supreme realm of martial arts. From Luo Fan's point of view, it was only a relatively good realm of martial arts. In the eyes of Luo Fan, it was only a relatively good realm of martial arts. Compared to his current state, where he could do as he pleased with martial arts, there was an unknown number of levels of difference. The instant the fire dragon formed by Taoist priest Skyfire pierced through his body, countless thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he truly realized all of this. At that moment, he suddenly understood what the martial emperor's mentality was, and why the martial emperor had given him so much convenience in the previous battle. There was no place in the world that did not contain martial arts. Martial arts were connected to everything in the world, inside and outside of the bodies of all living creatures, and through the thoughts and wills of all living creatures. This was simply the absolute truth of the universe. In comparison, the golden Dan of the innate stage, the Tao of power, the Tao of fire, the Tao of space-time, they were all unorthodox paths, and they were far from the true truth. However, such a truth was not recognized as the right path by others. Such a truth. However, he was the only one who could grasp it. Such a wonderful world of martial arts. Yet he was the only one. What kind of loneliness was this? What kind of loneliness was this? Just how sorrowful was that? Under such circumstances, seeing that Luo Fan, who was likely to enter the same world as him and was walking on the same path of truth, was constantly getting closer to the right path, it was no wonder that the martial monarch would suppress his desire to fight. Luo Fan had all the conditions that allowed his martial attainments to continuously rise. It's a pity that this is not the highest realm. There's still a long way to go before I can truly form a worldview. Otherwise, I might be able to obtain an inheritance at the level of Tao Master. Luo Fan could not help sighing to himself. Everything in the world was martial arts. Although it was already an incredible realm to cultivate martial arts to the point where one could do as one wished, without forming a truly complete worldview that could explain everything, one would not be able to reach the level of Tao Master. One's martial arts realm would not reach the highest level. Understanding this, Luo Fan instantly decided that he must keep in touch with the martial emperor in the future. There was no other reason for this decision. It was because he knew that if there was someone in the universe on Earth who could develop martial arts into a truly complete worldview, it was definitely the martial emperor. Even Luo Fan himself could not do that. After all, the worldview was a summary of a living being's understanding of the world. Therefore, the worldview that a living being believed in and could truly develop to its most perfect state could only be a single one. There is absolutely no living being other than the sage who could believe in two different worldviews at the same time. The reason why the sage was excluded was not that Luo Fan thought that the sage could have more than one worldview, but that Luo Fan did not understand the sage at all. He did not understand what kind of existence the sage was, so he could not make any conclusions about the existence at the level of the sage. Obviously, Luo Fan had begun to sort out his worldview at this time. That worldview was obviously not a martial arts worldview. Therefore, even if the current Luo Fan's attainments in martial arts were not much worse than the martial emperor's, it was impossible for him to truly develop a complete martial arts worldview. Only by treating martial arts as the most important and the only martial monarch would he be able to achieve what Luo Fan couldn't. Judging from the martial monarch's appearance, the only thing he lacked was a consciousness. As long as the martial emperor could realize that reaching this stage of the martial arts realm was not the end, and that there was still a realm above this realm of refining a complete martial arts worldview, then with his attainments in martial arts, he would definitely be able to break through the shackles of the current realm and become a Tao Master in the future. It was because of this that Luo Fan decided to keep in touch with the martial emperor. If the martial emperor was willing to befriend him, he would not be stingy to tell the martial emperor the correct cultivation direction, although he had made such a decision. But at this time, Luo Fan naturally could not say anything to the martial emperor. At this moment, he was still fighting with the Taoist priest of Heaven Fire. At this time, the Taoist priest of Heaven Fire cheered again. Luo Fan looked up and saw that the Taoist priest of Heaven Fire's eyes were full of fanaticism and joy, and his whole body was even emitting an incomparably strong flame. As soon as Luo Fan sensed the flame, he knew that it was not any kind of flame that existed in the natural world. Instead, it was a kind of flame formed by the fusion of billions of kinds of flames through some mysterious and unpredictable method. Such a flame contained the characteristics of billions of kinds of flames and possessed incredible mysterious power. The moment he saw the flame, Luo Fan suddenly understood the cultivation path of the Taoist priest of Heaven Fire. The cultivation of the Taoist priest of Heaven Fire was obviously to collect the endless flames that existed in the universe and try to fuse them into one, so that he could finally become the master of all the flames in the universe. Finally, with this advantage, he pushed the realm to the highest peak and finally became a saint. Such a path seemed to be very smooth. Reaching the Saint realm seemed to be countless times smoother than focusing on martial arts with the martial emperor. However, after knowing the cultivation path of the Taoist priest of heaven fire, Luo Fan sighed inwardly. Such a path seemed to be a straight path to the Saint realm. But in reality, it was not a path that could be taken. The Sage realm was a supreme realm that could not be killed or destroyed, and could not be destroyed by thousands of tribulations. Such an existence must be able to exist in the boundless chaos after the destruction of a universe, and must be able to walk on the path of chaos. Therefore, such an existence must be independent. They must be able to transform themselves into heaven and earth, and must regard the chaos as nothing. And to achieve this, the most basic thing was that he must have an incomparably firm and unquestionable understanding of himself, chaos, and heaven and earth. This was his worldview. The reason for this was that without a firm and unquestionable understanding of himself, chaos, and heaven and earth, he would not be able to equate himself, heaven and earth, and chaos. And if he could not equate the three in a state of chaos where anything could happen, as long as there was a slight change, wouldn't he be destroyed by the chaos, and millions of years of cultivation would go up in smoke? If that was the case, how could he be indestructible? How could he be immortal and indestructible? The only difference between the Taoist priest of heaven fire and the martial emperor was that the martial emperor treated martial arts as the only thing, while the Taoist priest of heaven fire only treated flames as a means. By treating martial arts as the only thing, there was the possibility of developing martial arts into a worldview that could explain everything. And by treating flames as a means, no matter what, it was impossible to develop it into a worldview. A means appeared to achieve a goal, and there had never been a living being who only had a means for the sake of it. Luo Fan did not show his pity. He was currently in a state of battle with the Taoist priest of heaven fire, not a debate. There was no time for him to be emotional. Moreover, his friendship with the Taoist priest of heaven fire was only average. Even if it was a debate, it was unlikely that he would share his thoughts with the Taoist priest of heaven fire. And even if he were to share his thoughts with the Taoist priest of heaven fire, he could predict that the Taoist priest of heaven fire's reaction would not be gratitude, but hatred. He would feel that Luo Fan was messing with his mind, and that Luo Fan had ulterior motives. After all, the Taoist priest of heaven fire had cultivated the way of fire for hundreds of millions of years. His understanding of fire was already deep in his bones and could not be changed. Even if he believed Luo Fan's words, he could not change his view. It was as if the great Tao was right in front of him, but he knew that he could not obtain it no matter what. Under such circumstances, he could only treat Luo Fan's views as ulterior motives. That was because if that was the case, he still had some hope of achieving Tao, although there were no abnormalities. But Luo Fan suddenly felt that there was no point in sparring with the Taoist priest of heaven fire. When he sparred with the Taoist priest of heaven fire before, it was only because his desire for battle was too strong, and he wanted to fight with someone else to enjoy the joy of battle. The Taoist priest of heaven fire had merely bumped into him. At this moment, he suddenly felt that he was so out of place with the Taoist priest of heaven fire. The position he was standing on seemed to be the same as the Taoist priest of heaven fire. But in reality, they were like two mountains or two cliffs separated by a bottomless abyss. Even if he did not have any ulterior motives, he naturally felt an inexplicable sense of rejection. It was precisely because of this feeling of rejection that the intense desire for battle that he had previously felt was instantly extinguished, as if it had been doused with ice water. In reality, at this moment, only 1 or 2 breaths had passed since he had started fighting with the Taoist priest of heaven fire. To be continued. Chapter 8:16. Everyone present didn't know that Luo Fan's mentality had suddenly changed like this, but they could feel that Luo Fan's body had suddenly undergone some inexplicable change. First words. For a moment, everyone was surprised that he had such a change. Even Taoist priest Skyfire, who had been fighting fervently, was surprised. His fervent desire to fight had greatly diminished. However, for existences at their level, Having hundreds of millions of clones was only the most basic of abilities. As a result, no one thought too much about it. They just assumed that something had happened to one of his clones somewhere else, resulting in this change. Although Taoist priest Skyfire's desire for battle was extremely strong, he was not blind to the bigger picture or unreasonable. As a result, after assuming that something had happened to Luo Fan elsewhere, he raised his hand and withdrew the fire dragons that were attacking Luo Fan. They coiled around him and said, "Looks like you're in a bit of an inconvenience right now. How about we end our sparring here?" Since something had happened to his other clones, it was naturally impossible for him to continue sparring in such a leisurely manner. Luo Fan was not in the mood to continue being entangled with Taoist priest Skyfire. Taoist priest Skyfire's words were exactly what he wanted, so he did not explain. He only said, "Thank you for your understanding, Taoist Skyfire. This really isn't the right time. I hope you can forgive me." He did not say anything clearly, but in the ears of Taoist priest Skyfire and the others, it meant that their previous guess was correct. For a moment, they all smiled in understanding and said nothing more. Since Luo Fan had matters to attend to, they naturally could not stay on the battlefield any longer. After Taoist priest Skyfire withdrew his clones, he opened the door to the battlefield and led Luo Fan and the others back to the guest area. Although they had already left, the items of the celestial realm were naturally different from those of the mortal world. Thus, the various melons, fruits, and fine wines in the guest room were no different from when they were in the celestial realm. It was impossible to tell that a long time had passed. After sitting down, Luo Fan closed his eyes and sat cross-legged, guarding his mind. The energy in his body slowly surged as he entered a state of cultivation. This was not because of anything else, but because of the great change in his mentality due to the previous enlightenment. For a moment, he was not in the mood to communicate with others. In this way of doing things, in the eyes of the others, they were even more convinced that Luo Fan had to be a clone or incarnation somewhere else. Something dangerous had happened, and at this moment, he should be focusing all his attention on that location to solve the problem. Naturally, they would not disturb Luo Fan. They just chatted among themselves. Taoist Heaven Fire, Space-Time Traveler Sky Maiden, and Martial Monarch had known each other for hundreds of millions of years. Their friendship might not be so deep that they could read each other's minds, but they were not ordinary Taoists after all. They knew each other quite well. The communication between them. Naturally, it would not be like the communication with Luo Fan. Instead, it would be more in-depth, and there would be less probing and uncertainty. What they talked about was their deeper understanding of the Great Path and cultivation since their last meeting. There were also many special events that happened in the world of cultivation in this Earth's universe, as well as all sorts of strange rumors. The information revealed in these words was naturally quite rich. If one were to listen on the side, it would not only be beneficial to one's cultivation, they would also have a better understanding of the world of cultivation in this Earth's universe. At the same time, they would be able to grasp the situation of this Earth's universe more accurately. Naturally, such a conversation would not end in a short time. When Luo Fan sorted out his state of mind, he also learned all sorts of things that he had just learned. It was only when the various increases in his level of cultivation had completely stabilized that their conversation got back on track. At this time, Luo Fan had already adjusted his state of mind. Although he still understood the differences between them, and also understood that he was superior to them, he would not have such a strong feeling of rejection like before. Under such circumstances, he slowly opened his eyes and let out a long sigh. While Taoist Heaven Fire and the others were deep in their conversation, they were constantly paying attention to Luo Fan. After all, Luo Fan was invited by the Heaven Fire Taoist to participate in some big event. If anything happened to him, Taoist Heaven Fire's invitation would have been in vain. Seeing such a change in Luo Fan, they naturally knew that the matter was over. Taoist Heaven Fire smiled and said, "Is everything going well, my friend?" "It's going well. It's Luo Fan's fault for making you worry." Luo Fan smiled and cupped his hands at them. Taoist Heaven Fire and the others saw this, and were finally able to relax. Emperor Wu said, "It's a good thing you're fine. If something had happened to you, the only person in this world who could compete with me in martial arts would have been gone. Haha, it's just a small matter. Now that it's been resolved, there's no need for you to worry," Luo Fan said. After a series of exchanges, the few of them relaxed. At this time, several days had passed since Luo Fan closed his eyes to regulate his breathing. During this time, none of the fellow Taoists invited by Taoist Heavenfire arrived. This showed how coincidental it was that space-time traveler and empty maiden arrived at the same time when Emperor Wu arrived. "I wonder how many fellow Taoists have you invited?" Seeing that there were still no seats around, Luo Fan couldn't help but feel curious. Seeing Luo Fan's expression, Taoist Heavenfire knew what Luo Fan was thinking. He smiled and said, "This time, this penniless Taoist sent 36 incarnations to invite fellow Taoists. I believe at least 30 fellow Taoists will give this penniless Taoist face. However, the distance between where these fellow Taoists are and this place is different, so it will take at least a few years for them to rush over." "I see." Luo Fan nodded to show that he understood, but said nothing more. Like Taoist Heavenfire and the others, Luo Fan did not think much of waiting for a few years. For existences who had cultivated to their current realm, thousands of years would pass in the blink of an eye. A few years was not much different from the blink of an eye to them. Waiting for fellow Taoists for a few years was naturally not a long time for them. Thus, after understanding the approximate number of invited cultivators and the approximate time, he did not express any dissatisfaction. Of course, Taoist Heavenfire and the others did not think that Luo Fan would be dissatisfied, so they did not explain or console Luo Fan. They only stopped talking about it after resolving Luo Fan's doubts and resumed their previous conversation. This time, with Luo Fan's participation, the span of their conversation was even greater. There were many times when a small question was extended to countless eras in history due to Luo Fan's doubts. Taoist Heavenfire and the others dug into the matters that seemed like common sense to them to a shocking depth. Not only did it give Luo Fan a deeper understanding of the ins and outs of the questions, it also allowed Taoist Heavenfire and the others to gain a new understanding of many minor issues, making them feel like they had a clearer view of the universe. Such a conversation naturally delighted them. Naturally, the few of them were very happy, so they continued to chat like this. Time passed slowly as they conversed. 3 years passed in the blink of an eye. During those 3 years, Taoist Heavenfire would go out from time to time. He would bring the cultivators that his clone had invited to a seat and invite them to join in the conversation with Luo Fan and the others. 3 years later, this place, which Taoist priest Skyfire used as a place to receive his guests, was almost full. The cultivators that Taoist Heavenfire invited were at least Khanate Grand Luo. Thus, at this time, 3 years later, on this piece of flat land, there were more than 30 Khanate Grand Luo present. Due to the atmosphere created between Luo Fan and Taoist Heavenfire, the newly joined Khanate Grand Luo did not do anything else. They simply gathered in a corner and conversed. Some of these Khanate Grand Luo cultivators had deep ties with each other. It was their first time meeting some of them. Luo Fan did not seem out of place among the 30 or so cultivators. At that moment, it was not just Luo Fan, the martial monarch, Taoist Heavenfire, and Voidwalker Void Maiden who were participating in Luo Fan's conversation. There were 6 other Khanate Grand Luo cultivators who had joined them. These 6 cultivators were not the first to arrive. Instead, they were 6 cultivators who were quite compatible with them in terms of cultivation philosophy and temperament. Among them, there was a man named Reverend Lu Zhao. He was looking at Voidwalker, Void Maiden with a different gaze. Even a blind man could sense the thoughts in his gaze. Apart from Reverend Lu Zhao, the others were quite friendly with each other as well. They were not complete strangers. Taoist Heavenfire was talking about a wondrous flame transformation technique when he suddenly thought of something. What a pity. Looks like only this many fellow Taoists are willing to come this time. Luo Fan thought of something. He could vaguely sense some sort of profound ripple seeping into Taoist Heaven Fire's body from nothingness. Clearly, Taoist Heaven Fire had just received a message from somewhere else. The message might have come from one of his other clones, or it might have come from one of the Khanate Grand Luo cultivators he had invited. But no matter what, this message definitely expressed some sort of rejection. That was without a doubt. After Taoist Heaven Fire was done speaking, he excused himself to Luo Fan and the others. He then stood up and walked to the center of the crowd, clearing his throat. As he cleared his throat, the originally quiet place fell silent. Everyone turned to look at Taoist Heaven Fire. Everyone present was invited by Taoist Heaven Fire to discuss a so-called important matter. They were not here to interact with other fellow Taoists. Although this interaction would benefit them greatly, how could it compare to the purpose of their visit? When Taoist Heaven Fire saw everyone looking at him, he smiled and said, "Greetings, fellow Taoists. This humble Taoist is truly grateful that everyone is willing to do me the honor of coming this time. Please accept this humble Taoist bow." With that, he bowed. Of course, the people present refused to accept it. Of course, even though everyone present here were clones, they at least possessed the cultivation at the innate golden immortal realm, and they weren't like ordinary mortals. So even though they declined, it didn't cause the surroundings to become clamorous. A short while later, silence was restored. After Taoist Heaven Fire bowed, he said, "Everyone knows who I am, so I won't speak empty words. This is the reason why I've invited everyone here." With that, he raised a finger and pointed. Countless colorful flames appeared out of thin air, condensing into a colorful canopy above. Then, the colors in the canopy converged, revealing a scene that resembled a real world. It was a strange starry sky. In the center of the starry sky was a strange star system. There were 3 stars in the star system. There were 9,999 planets in the star system, formed by the 3 stars. The planets revolved around the 3 stars according to an incredibly complicated and abstruse orbit. And in the middle of the 3 stars was a small, dusky vortex that seemed to have no interior. The vortex was faintly discernible, seemingly illusory and real. It seemed to be there, but it did not emit any aura at all. It was as if it did not exist at all, but it was also like an ordinary silhouette. However, the existence of the vortex seemed to be communicating with some unbelievably powerful existence. It was as if it possessed supreme might that could destroy the entire universe. "This is a time vortex." Suddenly, an old man exclaimed in surprise. Luo Fan looked over and realized that when the old man first arrived, Taoist Heaven Fire had introduced him as Old Man Omniscient. He said that he was the most knowledgeable cultivator in this universe, as if there was nothing in the universe that he did not know. Time vortex? What's that? The thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. Senior Omniscient is indeed knowledgeable. That's right, this is a time vortex. Taoist Heaven Fire also recognized Old Man Omniscient and praised him. Impossible. The time vortex only exists in legends. It's just a vortex formed by the flow of time. How can it really exist? Old Man Omniscient said in disbelief. We'll know soon enough whether it's possible or not. Senior Omniscient, there's no need to be anxious, Taoist Heaven Fire said. Old Man Omniscient suppressed his agitated emotions and took a few deep breaths. He said, "I've been rude. Please continue, Taoist." He slowly sat down as he spoke. When Old Man Omniscient exclaimed, "Just now," although the people around him did not say anything, their expressions changed drastically. They were either shocked, in disbelief, or sneered in disdain. In short, none of them could maintain their composure. If such emotional changes happened in the mortal world, the place would have become as noisy as a market. However, everyone present was a Khanate Zenith Heaven cultivator. Although they were agitated, they were able to retain their rationality and did not make any strange sounds because of their emotions. Taoist Heaven Fire clearly knew that everyone was eager to know the inside story. Hence, he did not keep them in suspense and said directly, "This location is in a galaxy at the edge of the universe. I discovered it hundreds of thousands of years ago when I was exploring the universe. At that time, I was curious when I discovered this galaxy with 3 stars, so I threw my incarnation into it to explore it. However, after I threw my incarnation into it, the incarnation completely lost contact with me. It was as if it had been forcibly cut off from me. Hence, after I personally entered the galaxy, I discovered that the primordial chi in the galaxy was extremely strange. Not only was it connate primordial chi, but it also retained some characteristics of chaotic primordial chi. It seemed to be in the process of evolving chaotic primordial chi into connate primordial chi. Old Man Omniscient nodded and said, "There are some places in this universe that are isolated from the rest of the world. It's indeed possible for them to maintain the style from a long time ago. That's not strange at all. It's fine if that's all. However, I discovered that the flow of time was extremely slow in that galaxy. It's as if that galaxy is a completely different space-time from the outside world," said Taoist Heavenfire. "How could that be?" Old Man Omniscient was shocked and almost stood up. Fortunately, he was still rational and knew that there was no need for such a huge reaction at the moment. Hence, he only exclaimed, "That's right. The flow of time in that galaxy is almost 10,000 times slower than the outside world. It's precisely because there's such a difference in the speed of light compared to the outside world that my incarnation lost contact with me after entering," said Taoist Heavenly Fire. After that, I scanned the entire galaxy and discovered that there was life on almost every planet in the galaxy. Moreover, those life forms were very primitive, as if they were living beings from ancient times that had survived to this day. Many of the legends that were passed down were from trillions of years ago. It was as if the galaxy had been completely frozen in time. At that time, I had a feeling that something unbelievable could be produced in that location. Hence, I searched even more carefully. Finally, after a few months, I found this vortex at the intersection of 3 stars in this galaxy. Taoist Heavenfire skipped countless minor details and revealed the main points in one go. Vortex of the Era. If that's really the case, it might really be a vortex of the era. Old Man Omniscient mumbled. Everyone has more or less heard of the legend of the era vortex. I'll tell you about it now. If you already know about it, you can match it with what you know, said Taoist Heavenfire. I hope that you can tell us quickly, Taoist Heavenfire. I don't know anything about the era vortex. This is the first time I've heard of it. I'll wait for you to answer my doubts, said an extremely skinny cultivator at that moment. When Taoist Heavenfire had introduced this cultivator to Luo Fan, he had called him Wuda. He was an ape-monkey cultivator who had attained the Tao. His fighting spirit was not inferior to Taoist Heavenfire's. To be continued. Chapter 817. The Heavenfire Taoist smiled and said, Fellow Taoists, I'm sure you all know that in our universe, there's an existence that transcends the laws that controls the entire universe. This existence is supreme, and even sages can't transcend it. That's because words originated from it. It divides the universe into countless eras every 6 billion years. Any living being, any existence, must abide by the rules of every era. Even sages can't go against the restrictions of an era. This kind of supreme existence has a name since ancient times, and that is the Age Chao stream. Everyone present had cultivated for hundreds of millions of years, and their understanding of the universe had already reached an unimaginable level. Naturally, they understood the existence of the Age of Chao, so all of them revealed expressions of agreement. Even Wuda, who was unfamiliar with the era vortex, agreed. He clearly knew about the existence of the era Chao stream. In a river, if there's a rock blocking the flow of the river, a whirlpool will appear. Similarly, if something blocks the flow of the era Chao stream, it will also form a vortex. This vortex is the era vortex. The Heavenfire Taoist said, I see. Then what's so special about the era vortex? Wuda asked in realization. According to the old legends, the era vortex is the only way for us to transcend the era Chao stream. The Heavenfire Taoist didn't explain further this time and directly told the legend. Perhaps He himself didn't know what the characteristics of the era vortex were. The era vortex, the vortex of the era Chao stream. So there's such an existence in the Earth's universe. Luo Fan's mind was in turmoil. He felt that his understanding of the Earth's universe was almost overturned. However, after thinking about it carefully, he also understood that the existence of the era vortex was, in fact, almost certain existence. Since the era Chao stream was a kind of era Chao stream, it naturally had a certain nature of flowing water. Naturally, there would be something that could block the surging flow, just like a river. The existence of a vortex was naturally a matter of course. He didn't think that such a vortex would appear. However, the power of the era Chao flow was so terrifying that even sages couldn't break free from it. He couldn't think of anything that could stop it, so he couldn't think of the root of the era Chao flow. Some of the Khanate Grand Luo in the surroundings had only heard of the legend of the time vortex now. Some of them were already known. After hearing Taoist Heaven Fire's explanation, their states of mind were naturally different. Their expressions also changed. But no matter how the situation changed, everyone was unable to maintain their composure, and their behavior was more or less different from before. Back then, after I knew that the vortex was the vortex of the times, I did not dare to probe it rashly. Thus, I immediately left that star system and gathered all my fellow Taoists to explore together, Taoist Heaven Fire said with a sigh. We will remember fellow Taoists' great kindness. Wuda praised. Hee, you flatter me, Taoist Wuda. It's not that I'm virtuous. It's just that the vortex of time is complex and mysterious. I can't even approach it, Taoist Heavenly Fire said without hiding anything. Wherever the era vortex is, there must be something that can stop the flow of the era. For us Khanate Grand Luo, if we were alone, we wouldn't be able to do so unless we had a saint's treasure. Otherwise, we would definitely be lost within and unable to extricate ourselves once we get close. Although you managed to escape, you must have suffered great losses, Old Man Tong Xiao said. He had regained his composure by now. Senior Tong Xiao is truly knowledgeable. While I could vaguely sense it, I couldn't tell the specifics. I only came to a sudden realization after hearing Senior Tong Xiao's words, Taoist Heaven Fire praised. However, he did not mention what his losses were. Still, everyone present did not need him to explain to know that his losses must have been shocking. Otherwise, why would he not monopolize a vortex that transcended the flow of the era, and instead invite his fellow Taoists to explore it together? Although it's the degenerate age now, as long as we Khanate Grand Luo are careful, we should be able to survive the 5-6 billion years. The time vortex is so dangerous. I'm afraid and dare not go. I'll take my leave now. At this moment, a cultivator who looked like a middle-aged Taoist stood up and spoke with a righteous expression. Existences that were able to cultivate to the innate golden immortal realm would definitely possess a perfect and firm Tao heart. Such existences wouldn't care too much about the opinions of others, and they had an extremely thorough grasp of their own mental state. Therefore, after this person felt fear in his heart, he didn't act like an ordinary person and say that he was busy. Instead, he directly revealed his true mental state and true fear without concealing it at all. Everyone's expressions changed when they heard the middle-aged Taoist's words. However, none of them looked down on the middle-aged Taoist. There were even a few who looked at him with admiration and a few who seemed to agree with him. Every Khanate Grand Luo cultivator's Taoist heart was perfect. They had their own judgment and persistence, and they understood that cultivators of the same level as them had their own determination and persistence. Even if they would not make the same choice as the middle-aged Taoist and would not be as fearful as he was, they understood that such choices and such fear were part of the middle-aged Taoist cultivation path, and there was nothing shameful about it. Under such circumstances, they naturally wouldn't show a look of disdain like the common people. Taoist Skyfire could not help but sigh when he heard the middle-aged Taoist words. He already knew that there would definitely be people who would have thoughts of retreating when they learned about the era vortex, so he was not surprised. He merely said, "It's my fault that I've delayed fellow Taoist Black Tortoise's cultivation. Here's a seed of spiritual fire as a token of my apology." As he spoke, a flame that shone with the radiance of wisdom appeared out of nowhere and condensed before the middle-aged Taoist. Spirit flame was a type of spirit flame, the flame of wisdom. If one relied on it to refine pills or equipment, it would be able to greatly increase the spirit of pills and equipment, and it was a rare treasure. Unless one truly cultivated the Tao of flames to the acme of perfection, it would absolutely be impossible to condense it. The middle-aged Taoist who was addressed as fellow Taoist Black Tortoise waved his hand and said, "I'm already feeling guilty for not being able to participate in this matter. How can I take your treasure?" As he spoke, he apologized to everyone before turning into a ray of light and shot into the sky. Soon, he left Taoist Skyfire's dimensional realm and disappeared into the vast universe. After the middle-aged Taoist who was addressed as fellow Taoist Black Tortoise left, a few other Khanate Grand Luo cultivators stood up and expressed their reluctance to take the risk and shame. They bid their farewells and left. Taoist Skyfire expressed his regret and apologies for every cultivator who left, giving them seeds of flexibility to thank them for coming. However, not a single cultivator actually took the seed of spiritual fire. The Taoist Black Tortoise had already set an example, so they naturally would not break it easily. After the terrified cultivators left, there were only 27 Khanate Grand Celestial Realm cultivators left, including Taoist Heavenfire. Among the 27, every single one of them was rather determined and unwilling to submit to reality. Among them, none of the few who had been communicating with Luo Fan left. "All right, since everyone has stayed, we'll discuss how we should explore the Era Vortex," Taoist Skyfire said as he looked at everyone. Being able to leave 27 people behind was already beyond his expectations. He had originally thought that it was already extremely rare for a dozen Khanate Grand Luo cultivators to stay. However, the truth was, it also made him understand that the dangers of the age of degeneration and the fear of his fellow Taoists in the universe was beyond his imagination. Taoist Tong Xiao nodded and said, "This matter must be discussed at length. The Era Vortex is of great importance. If we don't make sufficient preparations, so many of us will die within it, and our billions of years of cultivation will go up in smoke." That's how it should be. Everyone present naturally agreed and voiced their agreement. First of all, it's best for us to head to the Era Vortex with our bodies. "I'm sure no one has any doubts about that," Taoist Skyfire said. The request was clearly necessary. After all, the stellar system where the Era Vortex was located was isolated from the outside world. If a clone entered it, the connection between the clone and the main body would be instantly severed. Under such circumstances, even if the secrets of the Era Vortex were discovered, the clone would only be able to enjoy it, and the main body would not benefit much. However, this was not a forceful request. If someone could completely break through this isolation and be able to maintain contact with the clone, even if the main body was isolated from the outside world, they would naturally be able to send their clones there. Or perhaps there were cultivators who did not care about this. It did not matter if their clones obtained benefits and did not pass them on to the main body. That was naturally possible. That was why Taoist Skyfire used the word best. Everyone present clearly knew what Taoist Skyfire meant. Some nodded in agreement, while others frowned slightly. It was obvious that they were just weighing the matter. Among them, Luo Fan's reaction was different from the others. He did not nod, nor did he frown or hesitate. No matter how resolute the isolation was, could it be more thorough than the isolation between the primordial world and the Earth universe? Since he could send his clone to the Earth universe and the great Tianyuan world, he naturally would not mind sending his clone to the stellar system where the Era Vortex was located. Perhaps this was also the difference between Luo Fan and the other fellow Taoists present. The foundation of everyone present was in the Earth universe. What they wanted was to transcend the Earth universe. They wanted to obtain supreme mystical abilities and supreme Tao skills in the Earth universe, thereby advancing their quality to the saint level. As for their bodies, they were shackled to the age of Dharma ending in the current Earth universe. If they stayed in the age of Dharma ending, they could at most maintain their current Tao skills and mystical abilities. It would be difficult for them to transcend and reach the supreme saint realm. However, Luo Fan was different. Luo Fan's body was in the primordial world. His roots were also in the primordial world. Even the existence of this clone and the karma body was not shackled to the earth universe. It was not shackled to the age of Dharma ending. As a result, his mentality was more detached than the others. At that moment, what he wanted was nothing else. He only wanted to broaden his horizons and expand his knowledge. In the end, he wanted to comprehend the mysteries of the great Tao through his various encounters, so that his body and clone could better sort out their own worldview. They could better ascend to the Tao realm and better obtain the supreme mixed essence Tao fruit. This difference in mentality and goal meant that Luo Fan did not need to hesitate like the others. He also did not need to make up his mind to send his body into that unfathomable place like the others. Instead, he treated the willed doppelganger as an independent entity and allowed it to enter the galaxy by itself. He allowed the willed doppelganger to explore, experience dangers, and obtain benefits just like his own body. Seeing everyone's expressions, Taoist Heavenfire knew that they were carefully considering his words. He smiled and said, "Senior Omniscient, you are the most knowledgeable senior present. Why don't you make arrangements?" Old Man Omniscient frowned and thought for a while. Taoist Heavenfire said, "I know very little about this matter. It's still too early to make specific arrangements. Why don't you tell me every feeling and every experience you had in the galaxy? Only then can I know what the situation is like. Only then can I have some suggestions." Taoist Heavenfire already knew that Old Man Omniscient would have such a request, but he was not surprised at all. He did not hesitate at all. He began to explain in detail what he had experienced hundreds of thousands of years ago. At the same time, as he spoke, the scene formed by the colorful flames above his head began to change. It began to show the various things that Taoist Heavenfire had seen and heard back then. This explanation lasted for several years. Back then, Taoist Heavenfire had only stayed in the galaxy for a few months. However, this explanation and demonstration needed to start from all aspects. Analyzing the various things he had seen and heard, and the various phenomena naturally took several times, or even dozens of times longer than what he had experienced before. Old Man Omniscient frowned as Taoist Heavenfire demonstrated. He would ask questions from time to time, asking Taoist Heavenfire to describe in detail what he had felt back then and what he had sensed. Naturally, he could not show it in the scene. He could only describe it through Taoist Heavenfire's words or sense transmission to others. Taoist Heavenfire had clearly studied this countless times. He did not hesitate or feel annoyed at Old Man Omniscient's questions. He answered every question in detail. He repeated every scene he had requested. After several years, Old Man Omniscient was finally satisfied. He said, "I have a general idea of the situation. It seems that the Era Vortex is a legendary giant vortex. According to legend, such a vortex will distort the era the most. Perhaps it really can allow us to transcend this age of degeneration." Hearing Old Man Omniscient's words, the others were pleasantly surprised. Old Man Omniscient was publicly acknowledged as the most knowledgeable Khanate Zenith Heaven cultivator in the universe. His conclusion was naturally the most trustworthy and likely to be the truth among all the Khanate Zenith Heaven cultivators in the universe. Even Taoist Heavenfire was rather surprised when he heard Old Man Omniscient's words. However, the Era Vortex is so huge that its might is extremely shocking as well. "The preparations we have to make should be more complete," Old Man Omniscient said. At this moment, Taoist Heavenfire's mission seemed to have been completed. The leader of the exploration mission had unknowingly become Old Man Omniscient. Still, no one, not even Taoist Heavenfire, had any objections to it. After all, the exploration mission would determine whether they could continue to improve and transcend the age of degeneration. Compared to such a major event, the identity of the leader of the exploration mission was not even worth mentioning. According to Taoist Skyfire's description and the various legends I know, If one wants to enter the temporal vortex, one has to pass through 9,999 checkpoints and refine 36 Khanate Grand Luo level Dharma treasures. Only then will we be able to enter the era vortex safely. These are the possible checkpoints, as well as the requirements for the 36 Khanate Zenith Heaven artifacts. Please take a look, fellow Taoists. As Old Man Omniscient spoke, he lifted his hand and pointed. A mysterious light shot out of his hand and condensed into a screen of light in the air. The screen of light was extremely profound. It emitted an ancient aura as if countless years of history was compressed into the screen of light. Looking at the screen of light would naturally make one feel like they were looking at the river of history. Within this light screen, there were countless characters and diagrams densely packed together. A rough estimation would show that there were tens of billions of words. There were also tens of thousands of patterns. The entire screen of light was several tens of thousands of meters tall. It was almost like a sky screen that was displayed before them. If an ordinary person were to look at such a huge screen of light with so many words on it, they would probably feel dizzy. However, to the many Khanate Zenith Heaven cultivators present, the amount of information did not cause too much pressure. Of course, even though there wasn't much pressure, there were still billions of characters and tens of thousands of diagrams, and what they described was related to whether or not they could transcend this age of chaos, whether or not they could continue to ascend, whether or not they could reach the Supreme Saint Realm. So they naturally had to spend even more time to observe and study. Luo Fan frowned as he looked at the screen of light. He carefully absorbed the words and patterns on the screen of light into his mind, analyzing the various descriptions in detail. The first thing he paid attention to was not the 9,999 checkpoints, but the 36 Khanate Zenith Heaven artifacts. Khanate Zenith Heaven artifacts were Zenith Heaven artifacts in the primordial world. At this moment, even Luo Fan, who had the highest Taoist realm in the primordial world, only had one. It was easy to imagine how difficult it was to obtain 36 of them at once. However, Luo Fan did not mind. To be continued. Chapter 8:18. The Daluo Heavenly Treasure was a mystical treasure that could at least unleash the combat strength of an innate Grand Luo. Although it was easier to refine it compared to ordinary living beings becoming an innate Grand Luo due to various tricks, it was still a Grand Luo after all. Even though there was a slight difference in difficulty between the two, they were still on the same level. Text first. In this way, it would be a huge project to refine the 36 Daluo Heavenly Treasures, even if there were 27 innate Grand Luo cultivators present whose cultivation bases were at least 100 million years old. Even if it was the simplest and easiest magic treasure to refine amongst them, it would probably require a few hundreds of thousands of years to refine successfully. Moreover, the consumption was so great that it could even make an ordinary First Heaven Realm cultivator go bankrupt. Similar to Luo Fan, the other people's first concern was the 36 Daluo Heavenly Treasures. When they saw the refining method of the 36 Daluo Heavenly Treasures, everyone fell silent. They were all shocked by the huge project. They found it hard to accept. Although the 9,999 stages are complicated, it's not too difficult for us. As long as the steps are correct, it's just a matter of time for us to pass. However, these 36 innate Grand Luo Heavenly Treasures are the key to entering the era vortex. If there's one less, or one can't reach the level of an innate Grand Luo, we'll fail on the verge of success. Old Man Tong Xiao naturally knew how difficult it was to refine 36 Daluo Heavenly Treasures, so he emphasized it again. Innate Grand Luo Heavenly Treasures aren't easy to refine. Heaven Fire Taoist frowned and sighed. Even if it's difficult, there's no other way. The 36 innate Grand Luo Heavenly Treasures are the result of countless attempts. If we want to enter the era vortex, we must have these 36 Daluo Heavenly Treasures. There's no other way. Old Man Tong Xiao sighed. Everyone present had already guessed Old Man Tong Xiao's words. After all, if there were not so many innate Grand Luo Heavenly Treasures to enter the era vortex, why would Old Man Tong Xiao scare them with such a high requirement? In this case, The preparation time to explore the era vortex will take at least 500,000 years. At least 500,000 years. Meanwhile, the martial emperor sighed. The martial emperor walked the Tao of martial arts. In his heart, martial arts were the most important and almost the only thing. Obviously, although the Tao of martial arts was broad and profound, and there were also countless martial arts that could refine magic treasures, compared to the Tao of innate gold core, martial arts were not that specialized in refining Daoyuo heavenly treasures. Thus, even though he could refine natural immortal treasures, it was much more difficult for him than other cultivators. So perhaps other cultivators only required 100 to 200,000 years of time to refine a natural golden immortal treasure, yet he required almost 500,000 years to refine a single magic treasure successfully. 240,000 years should be enough. By then, I'll be able to pass these 36 Daoyuo spirit treasures. Master, by God, I King Realm Emperor's Saint. Sage, fellow Taoist, Wu Huang's Tao isn't suitable for tool refinement. So why don't you use the materials and ask a fellow Taoist who specializes in tool refinement to refine it for you? That way we can save some time, said old man Tong Xiao. I still have some experience in refining tools. I can refine fellow Taoist Wu Huang's share. Luo Fan's heart moved, and he said with a smile, Thank you, Luo Fan. The martial emperor was overjoyed. He bowed and thanked Luo Fan. Luo Fan just nodded and didn't say anything. Even someone like the martial emperor, who wasn't suitable for refining Daoyuo heavenly treasures, had chosen a Daoyuo heavenly treasure. How could the other innate grand Luo heavenly treasures refuse? After weighing the pros and cons, everyone, including Luo Fan, decided to refine a magical treasure. Luo Fan chose a Daoyuo heavenly treasure that was shaped like a stone lion. Moreover, the martial emperor chose a Daoyuo heavenly treasure that was shaped like a rod. Luo Fan was in charge of refining 2 Daoyuo heavenly treasures. Apart from Luo Fan and the martial emperor, the other cultivators each chose 1 or 2 innate grand Luo heavenly treasures that they were confident in refining. In just a few minutes, the 36 innate grand Luo heavenly treasures were distributed. After the task of refining the 36 Daoyuo heavenly treasures was distributed, everyone stopped. Everyone stopped. They didn't say anything, and they didn't leave either. They just waited quietly. Daoist Skyfire knew what they were waiting for the moment he saw their expressions. He smiled and said, This humble Daoist has left spatial coordinates outside the galaxy, where the vortex of time is located. Everyone can go there and take a look. Daoist Skyfire knew what everyone was thinking at first glance. It was obvious that they hadn't seen the era vortex and didn't dare to completely confirm its existence. They weren't willing to work for more than 200,000 years just based on Daoist Skyfire's one-sided story. Even if they did not believe that Daoist Heavenly Fire would lie like that, they had to see it with their own eyes. Everyone smiled and nodded slightly when they heard Daoist Heavenly Fire's words. Daoist Heavenly Fire did not have any objections. With a thought, the dimensional realm trembled slightly. Countless flames gathered towards Daoist Heavenly Fire's cave abode. In an instant, the void distorted and a 10-meter-tall door was formed in front of Daoist Heavenly Fire. As soon as the door was formed, a mysterious space-time ripple spread in all directions. The area around the door seemed to have completely separated from the world at that moment. This was a void portal that could lead to any location in the Earth's universe. Behind this door is the galaxy. Everyone, please enter, Daoist Heavenly Fire said. With that, he took the lead and stepped into the void door, disappearing from the dimensional realm. Old Man All-Knowing was right beside Daoist Heavenly Fire. He hurriedly followed behind. Old Man All-Knowing had gained a clear understanding of the era vortex from Daoist Heavenly Fire's various descriptions. He had even set up a way to enter the vortex based on the situation. However, he had never actually seen the era vortex with his own eyes. For someone like him who had been listening to stories about the era vortex for a long time and was known to know everything, it was naturally difficult for him to accept it. After completing Emperor Wu's task of refining treasures, the relationship between Luo Fan and Emperor Wu was very different. They looked at each other and smiled. They followed behind Old Man All-Knowing and entered the void door. As they entered, the other innate Grand Luo cultivators entered the void door one after another as well. They borrowed the mysterious power of the void door and moved through space-time. In an instant, they traversed countless light years and arrived at the place that many cultivators in the universe called the edge of the universe. The universe on Earth was boundless. However, even if it was a cultivator at the First Heaven Realm or Golden Immortal Realm, their understanding of the Earth and the universe was definitely limited to a certain range. Even if this range stretched for countless millions of light years and was vast beyond imagination, it still had a boundary and a certain range of limitations. It was the edge of the cultivator's knowledge. It was called the edge of the universe. Therefore, although it was the edge of the universe, it was not really the end of the universe on Earth. The instant Luo Fan and Emperor Wu stepped through the door, they felt as if the void was being folded infinitely. It flowed through their bodies, and in an instant, they seemed to have traversed countless light years. When everything stabilized, he looked around and realized that he was in a boundless starry sky. In the middle of the starry sky, it was the galaxy he saw in the projection that Taoist heavenly fire displayed. The universe is boundless. Even we connate grand heavenly immortals have limited knowledge. Emperor Wu sighed emotionally at the side. Although it was a vacuum, it was no different from an ordinary environment for existences like them. Naturally, it would not stop them from speaking. That's why we have to comprehend the changes and profundities of the universe. Luo Fan sighed emotionally as well. At this moment, many cultivators stepped out of the void door. Taoist Heavenly Fire smiled when he saw that everyone had arrived. That galaxy is up ahead. Follow me, fellow Taoists. The galaxy in front of them looked no different from an ordinary galaxy from afar. It was just that there were 2 more stars and a few thousand more planets. They did not expect that there would be a vortex of time that could make innate Grand Luo scramble for it. Everyone followed Taoist Heavenly Fire and flew out. In a few dozen breaths, they had traversed a distance of 5 million kilometers. They arrived at the boundary of the galaxy. It's here. If we step in from here, we'll be within the range of the galaxy. Time will instantly change by 10,000 times. Fellow Taoists, please prepare yourselves. Taoist Heavenly Fire stopped in the void and pointed at an invisible boundary. Luo Fan sensed it carefully and discovered that there was indeed an extremely obscure invisible barrier in front of them, where Taoist Heavenly Fire was pointing. The barrier was so obscure that it had almost reached an extreme. It was almost at an extreme. If Luo Fan had not been awakened by Taoist Heavenly Fire and paid attention, he would not have noticed its existence. As expected, the power of time and the power of space are slightly different. Luo Fan used his power vision to observe the area ahead and vaguely grasp some of the patterns. However, it was only a tiny bit. Even if he observed it with his power vision, the area ahead did not seem much different from the normal region. None of the innate Grand Luo around them were ordinary people, since they were invited by Taoist Heavenly Fire to discuss important matters. After being awakened by Taoist Heavenly Fire, they all felt that something was amiss, and all of them looked relieved. Although they knew that Taoist Heavenly Fire was not lying, there was still a difference between confirming it and guessing. After Taoist Heavenly Fire woke the others up, he raised a finger and pointed. A speck of fire appeared in the void ahead, instantly forming a ring-shaped passageway. The interior of the ring-shaped passageway seemed to be extremely long, spanning hundreds of thousands of kilometers. However, from the outside, it did not seem to have any thickness at all. It was merely a thin ring of fire. The others did not need Taoist Heavenly Fire's explanation to know that the ring of fire was a space-time passageway opened up by Taoist Heavenly Fire's clone within it. The space-time passageway had no other use other than to slow down the flow of time that was 10,000 times faster than it was originally. It allowed the living beings who entered the solar system through the space-time passageway to avoid the powerful impact of the drastic changes in the flow of time. The others immediately followed Taoist heavenly fire into the passageway. Luo Fan was extremely sensitive to changes in the flow of time. He could sense that the deeper they went into the passageway, the slower the flow of time around them became. When they passed through the passageway and looked back, the ring of fire was still hanging on their backs. The ring of fire looked as wondrous as ever, with an incomparably long passageway inside and a ring of fire that seemed to have no thickness on the outside. Moreover, Luo Fan could even sense the residual aura of his previous standing in the void behind the ring of fire. After passing through the passageway, an indescribable aura surged towards them. This aura contained a sense of desolation, and antiquity. It had the power to shock the souls of all living beings. It made every Kane Zenith Heaven cultivator who sensed this aura feel as if they had arrived at a brand new place that was more suitable for cultivation and seeking the Tao. Countless eras ago, every inch of the void on Earth and the universe should be filled with this aura. Luo Fan sensed this aura that seemed extremely familiar, yet extremely unfamiliar. He could not help but sigh. The reason why he was familiar with this aura was because it was extremely similar to the aura of the primordial world. The unfamiliar aura was naturally because although this aura was similar to the aura of the primordial world, it was qualitatively different. He had never sensed such an aura before. At this moment, the others also stepped out of the passageway. This time, they did not have as many people as Taoist heavenly fire. They immediately split up and began to wander around the solar system. They used their own eyes to personally see the solar system that Taoist heavenly fire had blown so much that it shook the heavens and the earth. As for what they had to pay attention to, Taoist heavenly fire had already described all of his experiences clearly. There was no need to say more. Luo Fan did not wander around. Instead, he and the martial emperor bid farewell to Taoist heavenly fire and headed towards the end of the solar system. They headed towards the center of the intersection of the three stars, intending to see what the era vortex looked like with their own eyes. Their speed was quite shocking and fast. They arrived at the center of the solar system and saw the vortex. It's very likely to be the era vortex. The moment he saw the vortex, Luo Fan sighed emotionally. That's right. The time and space around the vortex are extremely distorted. In the outside world, this distortion would have long turned space-time into powder. However, it still remains intact here. Only the era vortex has such characteristics. The martial emperor also sighed emotionally. Luo Fan originally had the idea of whether he could enter the era vortex without any help. However, the moment he saw the era vortex, he knew that this idea was absolutely impossible, because the distortion of time and space around the era vortex had reached an unbelievable level. The degree of distortion of time and space had surpassed what innate Zenith heavenly realm cultivators could endure. Even if Luo Fan's body came here, he would be torn to pieces by the distortion of time and space. He would die, and his soul would disperse. With this understanding, Luo Fan finally knew that Old Man All-Knowing's reputation was well-deserved. His arrangements were not without reason. The 36 Daluo heavenly treasures should be able to form a bridge that can directly cross into the era vortex from outside the solar system. The 9,999 checkpoints should correspond to the 9,999 planets. They're the 9,999 obstacles of this bridge. At that moment, Luo Fan also understood the true meaning of Old Man Tong's arrangements. He immediately said to the martial emperor, "I do have some experience in artifact crafting, but the materials I've gathered are far from enough. I wonder if you've gathered all the materials needed to craft artifacts. If you haven't, why don't we work together to gather them?" The martial monarch roared with laughter when he heard this, and he said, "Fellow Taoist, you're worrying too much. I'm not skilled in equipment refinement, but I have the hobby of gathering materials. In these past few billions of years, I've gathered more than enough materials to refine a few natural golden immortal treasures. It's a great favor that you're willing to help me craft artifacts. You don't have to fork out any materials for the 2 artifacts, you just have to get them from me. If that's the case, I'll be troubling you. Luo Fan was slightly taken aback. He then smiled and said without a hint of anger. The Martial Emperor's eyes lit up when he saw Luo Fan's reaction. He said with a smile, "Good, good, good. Fortunately, you didn't decline. If you did, I'm afraid I'll look down on you." As for the Martial Emperor, because of Luo Fan's extremely shocking and almost pinnacle attainments in martial arts, he had long since treated Luo Fan differently from others. He was practically certain that Luo Fan was the only cultivator in the entire universe that understood him, and he intended to become best friends with Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan clearly wanted the Martial Emperor to provide the materials for him, but he still refused and forced him to say a few words before reluctantly accepting, then to the Martial Emperor, it would mean that Luo Fan didn't want to talk to him, and it would naturally make the Martial Emperor unhappy. At this moment, Luo Fan wasn't angry at all and directly confessed his thoughts. This showed his attitude. Compared to that, what was the materials for a zenith heavenly treasure? Luo Fan shook his head and chuckled, but he didn't say anything. At this moment, the 2 of them had already seen the time vortex, and it was meaningless to stay here. So they didn't need to discuss anything, and they turned around and flew out tacitly. Not long after, they arrived at the entrance of the galaxy. They saw the Heaven Fire Taoist who was standing there waiting for them. "Fellow Taoists, don't you want to continue watching this place?" Taoist Heaven Flame couldn't help but ask in surprise when he saw Luo Fan and the Martial Emperor return so quickly. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 819. We've already seen each other. We'll have plenty of time to come again after the treasure is refined, but there's no need for that now. Words first, Luo Fan said with a smile. The Martial Emperor also said, "The flow of time here is tens of thousands of times slower than the outside world. If we waste too much time here, we'll definitely have less time to refine the treasure. It's best to hurry." The Skyfire Taoist smiled and told the 2 of them to take care. He opened the door to the outside world. Luo Fan and the Martial Monarch could naturally use their own divine powers to open the passageway, but that would require a lot of essence chi. Since the passageway opened by Taoist Skyfire already existed, there was no need for them to waste any more essence chi. After bidding farewell to the Martial Emperor and the Skyfire Taoist, Luo Fan entered the passage and left the star system. After leaving the passage, he turned around and saw the Skyfire Taoist a few feet behind him. However, he had already stopped, as if he had turned into a statue. When Luo Fan and the Martial Monarch saw this, they knew that this was a sign of a huge difference in the flow of time, so they weren't surprised. Luo Fan immediately said, "May I know where your cave is?" "I'll know after sensing it carefully," the Martial Emperor said with a smile. As he spoke, he focused his senses. After a while, he smiled and said, "This is the edge of the universe, but it's in the same direction as my dwelling. The distance between the 2 is only 13 billion light years." In reality, while the Martial Emperor was sensing the location of his dwelling, Luo Fan was also sensing the location of his body on Earth. The result of his senses was that the body was over 20 billion light years away from where he was currently. It would take him tens of thousands of years of cultivation to cross such a distance, even if he were to open a void door and directly cross the void. Hearing the Martial Monarch's words, Luo Fan nodded his head and said, "Since that's the case, let's set off and refine the treasure as soon as possible." "We'll refine the treasure as soon as possible and relax." The Martial Emperor nodded. His body trembled, and the martial power in his body instantly boiled. The surrounding space, time, and even the laws of the universe underwent indescribable changes as his martial power boiled. As this happened, time and space before the Martial Emperor seemed to be folded countless times. A hazy shadow gradually appeared in front of Luo Fan and Martial Emperor. Through the light, There seemed to be a strange nebulous swirling and brewing within it. The feeling of space folding became more and more obvious, and the light and shadow became clearer and clearer. After a few dozen breaths, the light and shadow finally became completely real, and the feeling of space folding completely disappeared. What replaced this feeling of space folding was a strange feeling of the void being shattered in time and space being reorganized. "Fellow cultivator, please." The martial emperor's face was slightly pale as he spoke. Obviously, folding the void and opening up a void door that spanned such a huge distance was still a little too much for him. After all, he was only a clone. The power of his divine powers was naturally far inferior to Taoist priest Heavenly Fire, who was on par with him. As a result, he was in a much more miserable state than Taoist priest Heavenly Fire. Luo Fan smiled. Without any hesitation, he took a step forward. He stepped into the void door. In an instant, time and space flowed as if there were countless spaces flowing past him. In a trance, Luo Fan had already arrived at a brand new world. This was a star system, but the stars and planets of this star system had already been wrapped up by a huge domain. This domain was incomparably powerful and stable. It directly isolated the star system from the outside world, allowing everything within the star system to be controlled by the creator of the domain. It made it difficult for anything from the outside world to invade the domain and truly affect everything within the domain. Behind Luo Fan, the Martial Emperor also followed him through the void door and floated beside Luo Fan. After the two of them passed through the void door, it slightly shook. It was then suppressed by the boundless universe and turned invisible once again, as if it had never appeared before. "I cultivate in martial arts, but the world I opened up is somewhat different from the others. Fellow Taoist, please don't take offense." The Martial Emperor smiled. "Fellow Taoist, you have a wonderful idea. You can do what others can't. What's there to be surprised about?" Luo Fan shook his head and laughed. As the two of them spoke, the Martial Emperor led Luo Fan into the inner part of the star system. As soon as they entered, they felt an incomparably strong battle intent assault them. The surrounding was not like the innate essence chi of the other innate realm cultivators' cave dwellings. Instead, it was a type of innate essence chi that had undergone an earth-shattering change after being refined. This kind of essence chi contained traces of the characteristics of martial power. If a normal living being were to inhale it, they would naturally be able to receive the various martial arts principles contained within it. If a cultivator were to step onto the path of cultivation in such an environment, they would naturally walk onto the path of martial arts. However, because the Yuan Qi it had always absorbed contained the characteristics of martial power, when it cultivated in a world where martial power did not exist in the outside world, its ability to comprehend martial arts would be slightly worse than other living beings, and it would be even more difficult for it to improve. However, if he could overcome these difficulties, his improvement would be even greater. This could be considered as a gain and a loss. Between the pros and cons, it would depend on the living being's own choice. When the Martial Emperor saw Luo Fan's expression after he stepped into the star system, he knew that Luo Fan's thoughts had changed. He couldn't help but sigh and say, "This is also the only choice I have. If I don't refine the essence chi, even the living beings born in the world I created will naturally step into the path of the golden core under the guidance of the heavens and earth, and it will be difficult for them to step into the path of martial arts." Although Luo Fan understood the Martial Emperor's thoughts, he didn't agree with this. After all, to promote martial arts, it wasn't enough to just increase the number of people who cultivated martial arts. More importantly, he had to let all living beings have a better understanding of martial arts. He had to make all living beings admit that martial arts was a path that led directly to the supreme realm of transcendence. Only then could martial arts truly flourish, and only then could it be considered to be truly flourishing. Although the Martial Emperor's actions seemed to have increased the number of people who cultivated martial arts, in reality, the living beings who cultivated martial arts did not have much of a choice. In other words, They did not cultivate martial arts because of the choice in their hearts. If they encountered other cultivation methods in the future, such as the path of the golden core, they would definitely change the focus of their cultivation to the path of the golden core. Luo Fan did not believe that the martial emperor could not see this. However, although he could see it clearly in his heart. However, Luo Fan would not say it at this time. It was one thing to be honest, but it was another to speak without looking at the situation. At this moment, the martial emperor was clearly opening up this world to console himself. If he attacked the martial emperor without understanding the situation, even if he didn't say it out loud, he would definitely feel a little uncomfortable in his heart. What was the point of doing something so trivial? As such, Luo Fan only nodded non-committally. After Luo Fan's changes, the star system had condensed into a whole. From the outside, the star system did not seem any different from other star systems. However, once one stepped into it, one would discover that the star system was fundamentally different from other star systems in the outside world. The planets in other star systems revolved around stars. Planets were also many times smaller than stars. However, in this star system that the martial emperor had changed, the one that occupied the most central position was a planet that was thousands of times larger than the stars in ordinary star systems. The star that should have been the center of the entire star system was split into 3,602 parts by some supreme power. They were like stars, the moon, and the stars that constantly revolved around the planet. The star that should have been the center of the entire galaxy was split into 3,602 parts by some kind of supreme power. Like the sun, the moon, and the stars, they revolved around the planet nonstop. The star that should have been the center of the entire star system had been split into 3,602 parts by some supreme power. They were like stars, the moon, and the stars that constantly revolved around the planet. Luo Fan listened. When Luo Fan heard this, he knew that the voice was not from the martial emperor who was standing beside him. He turned his head to look at the source of the voice and discovered that it was a person that looked exactly like the martial emperor. However, the aura emitted by his body was countless times stronger than that of the martial emperor. He was floating not far away and smiling at him. In that instant, Luo Fan understood that this person was the martial emperor's true body. He turned his head to look, and sure enough, he saw that the martial emperor's figure was gradually turning illusory. A stream of light flowed towards the person that had just appeared, gradually pouring into his body and finally disappearing into nothingness. Fellow Taoist has done something that Fan has never thought of. It will only make Fan feel admiration. What's it to laugh at? Luo Fan smiled. He said, the martial emperor laughed and said, fellow Taoist, there's no need to flatter me. However, I know that the structure of the martial world here is only created by me according to the legends of mortals. It's difficult for it to even operate on its own. If not for me suppressing it, it would have collapsed and died at some point in time. Luo Fan shook his head and smiled, saying, fellow Taoist, aren't you here right now? When the martial emperor heard this, he laughed. As he spoke, the martial emperor had already brought Luo Fan down towards the incomparably huge planet. The planet was so huge, but the atmosphere around it was also extremely thick. The entire surface of the atmosphere was surrounded by layers of astral energy, forming an incomparably complicated system. At the same time that it blocked all sorts of vile auras from the outside world from invading the surface of the planet, it also prevented the living beings on the surface of the planet from crossing the atmosphere and leaving the planet. Of course, to Luo Fan and the martial emperor, this kind of obstruction was equivalent to not having any effect. They easily passed through the 300 layers of astral energy and entered the surface of the planet. The energy on the surface of the planet contained martial power that was more than 100 times denser than the outside world. Such a dense martial power could already be barely sensed by ordinary living beings. As soon as he stepped onto the surface of the planet, Luo Fan could sense the auras of countless martial artists occupying it. Amongst these martial artists, there was no lack of existences that could be compared to the immortal realm, which was the golden core of the innate realm. However, The ones with the highest cultivation were only existences like this. Not to mention those who were close to the martial emperor. There wasn't even a single living being who could understand what realm the martial emperor was at. The martial emperor did not bring Luo Fan to a certain place in the void. Instead, he directly landed on a tall mountain on the planet. This mountain was not even the tallest mountain on this planet. It was just an extremely well-hidden place in a rather exquisite location. The moment Luo Fan stepped into the range of the martial god peak, there was a faint flow of information that wanted to invade Luo Fan's mind. Among this flow of information, there were 3 words that contained boundless martial arts profundities. Even if ordinary creatures saw them, they would be able to gain countless martial arts insights. It was very obvious that this stream of information was added to the mountain by the martial emperor, so that any living being that approached the mountain would be able to know what kind of mountain it was and how profound it was. The martial emperor brought Luo Fan to the top of the mountain. There were no large buildings here. There was only a martial arts field and a few stone houses. The place where Luo Fan and the martial emperor landed was precisely in the training field. As soon as he stepped in the training field, Luo Fan's expression changed slightly, and he said, "Fellow Taoist, you must have expended a lot of energy on this training field, right? Ashamed. It still can't compare to fellow Heavenly Fire's battlefield." The martial emperor smiled and said, "The space around the training grounds was different from the outside world. The strength of the space here was many times more stable than the outside world, almost surpassing the strength of the space in the Great Thousand Worlds. Even compared to Taoist Heavenly Fire's battlefield, it was not the slightest bit inferior. However, the area of this martial arts field was only a few 100,000 feet wide. Compared to Taoist Priest Heavenly Fire's battlefield, it was countless times smaller. In comparison, it was naturally much weaker. It's just that the area is a little inferior, but it can't be considered a difference." Luo Fan smiled and said. As they spoke, the martial emperor had already led Luo Fan to a building. The entire building complex was empty. There were no other auras. It was obvious that only the martial monarch lived here on a regular basis. The stone house in front of Luo Fan had a simple structure. At first glance, it seemed to be no different from the other stone houses. However, if one looked carefully, one would notice that this stone house was slightly different from the other stone houses. It had no windows. This is the storehouse. Most of the materials I've gathered over the years are here. The martial emperor smiled. As he spoke, he raised his hand and pointed, and a supreme force that contained martial power blasted the door of the stone house. As the force of the finger entered, the stone house shook, and the door opened with a bang, revealing an enormous space that was countless times larger than before. The light within was boundless, and countless treasures flickered and collided within it. It illuminated the enormous space in an extremely profound manner, and it was like a dream. Luo Fan's face shook. He instantly sensed that there were countless treasures that contained all sorts of laws. Even the countless treasures contained the power to destroy space. Fellow Taoist, you're truly too modest. With so many materials, you can refine a few tens of natural golden immortal treasures, or even a few hundred. It's more than enough to refine, and it's even to the extent that you don't have to care too much about wastage. Luo Fan gazed at the martial emperor with a strange expression as he spoke. Air! I forgot that fellow Taoist ability in equipment refinement surpasses mine by 100 times. Such materials are indeed only capable of refining a few tens of natural golden immortal treasures. The martial emperor spoke with a rather embarrassed expression. Luo Fan couldn't help but feel slightly speechless when he heard this. Originally, he thought that the martial monarch's ability in equipment refinement was still passable, and it was just comparatively slow at most. However, he never expected that the martial monarch's ability in equipment refinement would actually be inferior to such an extent, and he actually wasted materials that exceeded others by 100 times in order to refine a natural golden immortal treasure. This had rather exceeded his expectations. Looks like fellow Taoist didn't put much effort into equipment refinement. Luo Fan could only sigh like this. The reason he came to such a conclusion was because even Luo Fan himself was able to rely on his martial techniques to create numerous equipment refinement methods that weren't inferior to other cultivators. Even if his speed was slightly slower, the effect of the materials he wasted wouldn't be much different. Since Luo Fan, who wasn't fully concentrated on his martial techniques, was able to accomplish this, since she didn't believe that the martial emperor, who took martial techniques to be his everything, would be unable to accomplish this. I'm ashamed. I've wholeheartedly focused on advancing my cultivation and martial techniques, yet I haven't had the time to study equipment refinement, pill refinement, and the like. The martial emperor spoke with slight shame. Luo Fan couldn't help but shake his head and sigh as he said, "Since fellow Taoist has the intention to promote martial techniques, then why didn't you put some effort into equipment refinement and pill refinement? After all, unless one's Tao heart is truly firm and unyielding, most living beings only pay attention to the benefits in front of them. Martial techniques can't compare to other cultivation techniques in terms of equipment refinement and pill refinement, so they naturally place it as their second choice. I know that as well. However, if there aren't any examples of martial techniques that transcend, how could those with truly firm and unyielding Tao hearts believe that martial techniques are the path to the heavens? If there aren't any people with firm and unyielding Tao hearts joining them, then what's the point of paying more attention to the cultivation of martial techniques of the living beings in front of them? The martial emperor had obviously thought about this problem before, yet he spoke helplessly. When Luo Fan heard this, he only sighed, but it wasn't good for him to say anything else. After all, everyone had their own thoughts. Luo Fan's own thoughts were based on his judgment, and the martial emperor's judgment was also based on his own judgment. This difference in opinion was impossible to change. If Luo Fan were to continue speaking, then it might cause both of them to be unhappy. As they spoke, Luo Fan and the martial emperor had already stepped into the storeroom. The storeroom was filled with an indescribable martial intent. This martial intent seemed to have frozen time, allowing everything in the storeroom to be preserved for a longer period of time. Although Luo Fan had never seen too many cultivation materials from Earth's universe, with his knowledge and perception, he could instantly tell which materials he needed to refine the two great Luo heavenly treasures. As a result, he did not hesitate too much. In a few breaths of time, he had chosen thousands of materials according to the requirements of the lion-like Great Luo heavenly treasure and the rod-like Great Luo heavenly treasure, and pointed them out to the martial emperor. The martial emperor controlled the storeroom to change naturally. The thousands of materials broke free from the seal of the martial intent and floated towards Luo Fan. With a wave of his hand, Luo Fan released a wave of spatial energy and put away the thousands of materials. He then left the storeroom with the martial emperor. To be continued. Chapter 820. Refining treasures takes up too much time. Why don't we start now? Luo Fan said, "I'll be there when I find the material for the novel. How can I help?" The martial emperor said with some embarrassment, "It's fine. With so many materials, refining treasures won't take up too much effort. You can just watch from the side," Luo Fan said with a smile. "I'm ashamed. Come this way," the martial emperor said. After saying that, he led Luo Fan to another stone house. The stone house didn't look special on the surface, but it naturally emitted a peaceful aura. It was clearly the place where the martial emperor cultivated. The martial emperor opened the door to the stone house with a finger force. Inside was a rather large space filled with incomparably dense, innate vitality. However, this innate vitality wasn't like the innate vitality of the outside world that was contaminated with martial power. Instead, it was extremely pure, innate vitality that was condensed from the natural energy of the world. The martial power of the entire planet was formed from the assimilation of the martial power within the martial emperor's body. It naturally didn't benefit the martial emperor. What the martial emperor needed to cultivate was incomparably pure, innate vitality. This innate vitality was also quite useful to Luo Fan. He didn't need to convert the vitality of the outside world to be able to use it. Stepping into it, one would feel a sense of calmness. It was an invisible and intangible martial will that would naturally affect all living beings who stepped into it. Naturally, the minds of all living beings would become closer to their nature and become more suitable for cultivation. Expanding space was a basic ability for any innate Grand Luo cultivator. The Martial Emperor was different from other innate Grand Luo cultivators. He directly opened up his cave abode in a certain part of the world he created and mixed with the living beings in his world. However, he was still an innate Grand Luo after all. He naturally didn't want to be shackled to a small space. Thus, even the interior of this stone house that was used for cultivation had been expanded by hundreds of times. It looked extremely spacious, but it didn't make people feel pressured at all. Luo Fan sized it up and nodded slightly. He didn't say much. Although the design of this room was ingenious, there was nothing to praise about. Clearly, the Martial Emperor didn't wait for him to praise it. There was naturally no need for him to say anything else. Fellow Taoist, the Martial Sovereign made a gesture of greeting. Said, Luo Fan slightly smiled and went to sit cross-legged on a praying mat in the room. After Luo Fan sat down, the Force Monarch sat on another praying mat not far from Luo Fan. He opened his eyes and looked at Luo Fan quietly, waiting for Luo Fan to make a move. Although the martial monarch's mentality was different from Luo Fan's, he believed that creating martial arts suitable for refining weapons and alchemy would be beneficial to the dissemination of martial arts. It could be said that he had no interest in alchemy or weapon refining, but at this moment, when Luo Fan said that he would help him refine a treasure, he naturally couldn't ignore it and cultivate by himself. After sitting down, Luo Fan raised his hand and pointed at the thousands of materials he had taken out from the storeroom. One by one, he released them from the spatial energy. These materials could be used by Luo Fan to refine the two Daluo heavenly treasures. With their help, the refining of the Daluo heavenly treasures wouldn't require too much effort from him. These materials were naturally not ordinary. The moment they were released, in an instant, countless strange lights were released, dyeing the originally deep and quiet cultivation room with colorful lights. It was like a land of dreams. Even the endless martial will that affected all the living beings here, causing them to become peaceful and quiet, was unable to affect them in the slightest. The countless brilliant lights darted about in all directions, leaving behind countless extremely mysterious trails in void space. Luo Fan's knowledge was extremely vast. Refining treasures was troublesome for him, but it wasn't difficult. Quite a lot of time had passed since he had refined the two treasures. During this time, he had already come up with a complete plan on how to refine the two treasures and raise them to the innate Daluo level. Now that the materials were in front of him, he didn't need to hesitate at all. With a slight thought, dozens of materials formed in front of him, refining innate Daluo heavenly treasures. In other words, Daluo heavenly treasures couldn't be refined to the innate Daluo level in one go. Instead, he had to first refine a magic tool, then upgrade it to a magic treasure, and then upgrade it to a primordial unity treasure. Only then could he upgrade it to a Daluo heavenly treasure. One could imagine the huge amount of work involved. Even when Luo Fan had the support of the whole world and the untainted world, it took him hundreds of millions of years to complete the process. Although the quality of the two treasures refined this time was far inferior to that of the Infinite Void Palace, and it didn't take too much of Luo Fan's energy, it was impossible for him to refine them at will. When Old Man Omniscient announced the required Khanate Daluo treasures, he'd roughly explained the requirements of every single one of them. Moreover, he made sure to use the same method to refine every single one of them. This was clearly a necessity. After all, the 36 Khanate Daluo treasures would be combined to form a bridge in the end. If the refining method used was different, then some unnecessary flaws would definitely appear, causing the final bridge to be incomplete. Therefore, even though Luo Fan had countless refining methods, he could only choose one of them, which was also the most popular and orthodox refining method in the Earth's universe, the the talisman refining method. In terms of quality, such a talisman refining method was not much different from the restriction refining method of the untainted world. It was also through layers of talisman systems that constantly overlapped and fused, and finally produced a mysterious and incredible change, condensing into a kind of treasure spirit that turned a magic tool into a magic treasure. However, after it became a magic treasure, its distinction was different from that of the restriction refining method. The restriction refining method was directly divided into immortal Tao treasure, primordial unity treasure, Daluo heavenly treasure, and supreme chaotic spiritual treasure. The talisman refining method was divided into gold core treasure, stainless treasure, Daluo treasure, and sage treasure. In addition to the sage treasure, the other three were divided into innate and acquired. The three levels of innate corresponded to immortal Tao treasure, primordial unity treasure, and Daluo heavenly treasure. The acquired ones were quite inferior. Even Daluo treasures were at most equivalent to the peak of immortal Tao treasure. Of course, these were the orthodox names. Generally speaking, most cultivators would not call magic treasures that way. Instead, they would give magic treasures grade. Generally, innate gold core treasure was a longevity grade magic treasure. Innate stainless treasure was a pure yang grade magic treasure. Innate Daluo treasure was a pure yang grade magic treasure. Innate Daluo treasure was a perfect grade magic treasure. As for sage treasure, it was needless to say that it was a sage-level magic treasure. The reason for this was that although the orthodox names were strict, they could not show the characteristics of each grade of magic treasure. The latter names did not have such a drawback. As long as one looked at the name, one could roughly guess how precious this magic treasure was and what its most important characteristics were. Luo Fan had read countless ancient books in the heavenly realm of the Earth Sun. He had a deep understanding of the talisman refining method. At this moment, he did not even need to think much about it. With a thought, countless talismans were shot out by him. They were split into two and blasted into the two piles of materials in front of him. The refining of magic treasures required various environments, such as special flames. For example, special water sources, special winds, and so on. But that was only for ordinary cultivators. A Khanate Daluo realm cultivator who specialized in refining magic treasures. He could easily simulate any changes that could be caused by any special environment. Therefore, even if he needed the unique environment on Earth in the universe, it was just a matter of a few thoughts for a Khanate Daluo realm cultivator. Obviously, Luo Fan was such a Khanate Daluo realm cultivator. Therefore, although the refining methods of the two magic treasures that Old Man Omniscient mentioned were different, one required a flame similar to the divine heavenly fire, while the other required the addition of the black hole divine wind that could only be obtained from a black hole in the universe. However, Luo Fan only needed a few talismans to easily deal with the changes required to add the heavenly fire and divine wind. It allowed the materials to naturally undergo various inexplicable changes. Every single one of those dozens of materials was constantly emitting boundless treasure light, because these materials had a certain special connection with each other. Otherwise, how could Luo Fan choose them to build a magic treasure? Therefore, the treasure light they emitted naturally had all sorts of strange compatibility characteristics. Such compatibility characteristics began to gradually strengthen as the countless talismans that Luo Fan shot out entered. Finally, when the talismans that Luo Fan shot out increased to hundreds of millions, the gaps between the treasure light and the two piles of materials were instantly broken, and the treasure light in the two piles of materials fused. The treasure light that Luo Fan used to forge the lion-shaped magic treasure, which was also the magic treasure that Luo Fan personally refined, fused into a golden brilliance that emitted the aura of an emperor. On the other hand, the treasure light of the pile of magic treasure that was forged into a long rod fused into a dark red luster, emanating the aura of iron and blood. When the two treasure lights condensed, the two piles of materials began to change. In an instant, each of the materials crumbled and turned into fine powder. The fine powder did not scatter in all directions. Instead, it condensed in midair and began to construct and condense within the treasure light, according to an incredibly complicated and profound method. During that period of time, there seemed to be countless talismans that were instantly formed and instantly vanished. The entire process lasted for an unknown period of time. By the time everything had stabilized, the two piles of materials had already turned into something that looked like pills. That's right, they were not two magic treasures that had taken shape. Instead, they were two pills that looked only the size of pigeon eggs. They looked extremely mysterious and exuded a perfect aura. Among them, the pill that emitted a golden brilliance was completely golden, and the aura of an emperor was even stronger than before. On the other hand, the pill that emitted a dark red brilliance was completely dark red, and its aura of iron and blood was also 100 times stronger than before. These two pills were the prototypes of the magic treasures that Luo Fan needed to forge, which were also two magic treasures. These two magic treasures had just taken shape, and all the talismans inside them were only one layer. In other words, they were magic treasures that were equivalent to one layer of restrictions in the primordial world. Of course, these two magic treasures were forged by Luo Fan and were thousands of times more powerful than ordinary magic treasures with one layer of talismans. In a battle, such a magic treasure with one layer of talismans could at least be equivalent to a magic treasure with 10 layers of talismans. As long as these two magic treasures were upgraded to 10 layers of talismans, ordinary magic treasures would definitely not be comparable to them unless they were upgraded to immortal-level magic treasures. The power of these two magic treasures was just that strong. The Martial Emperor had been watching wholeheartedly while Luo Fan was forging. The more he watched, the more he admired Luo Fan. It was naturally not difficult for him to forge these two magic treasures. However, if he were to do it, it would be impossible for him to grasp the characteristics of each material so perfectly. It was impossible for him to do it so smoothly. It would definitely cause countless conflicts between the materials like in a battle, causing them to gradually fuse in the process of conflict. Such a fusion rate would naturally not be inferior to the fusion rate that Luo Fan guided, but it would definitely cause the wastage of the materials, causing many materials to be unable to unleash their functions. In the eyes of ordinary people, this method allowed the materials to fight on their own to get rid of unnecessary impurities. It was an excellent method to increase the power of the magic treasure, but in the eyes of Connate Zenith Heaven cultivators, it was a waste of materials. After all, since the so-called impurities in each material existed in the material, they would naturally be removed as impurities if they were more or less useful to the material. Although it would make the material pure, it would definitely make the so-called impurities lose their usefulness to the material, causing the material to suffer some kind of invisible loss. In fact, this was the root reason why the Martial Emperor needed more materials to forge the magic treasure. In addition to this drawback, the time needed to wait for the materials to fight and fuse on their own was at least twice as long as it was now. The Martial Emperor had long known about these drawbacks, but because he had never really seen a cultivator who could truly use other refining methods to the acme of perfection, he did not feel such a direct and obvious feeling about these drawbacks. Naturally, the impact on his heart was not as strong as it was now. Perhaps it's not that these drawbacks can't be changed. With my attainments in martial arts, it doesn't seem to be difficult to create a refining martial art without these drawbacks. This way, I can also save a lot of time to cultivate. The Martial Emperor suddenly had such a thought. The Martial Emperor could be regarded as the supreme martial art by the entire cultivation world of Earth. There was no need to say much more about his attainments in martial arts. Such a thought flashed through his mind. In an instant, there were countless martial arts that flowed through his mind and consciousness. If any of these martial arts were to be placed in the outside world, they would be regarded as priceless treasures by any cultivator who is interested in martial arts. Even if they abandoned their wives and killed everyone in the world, they would still want to take a look. However, in the mind of the Martial Emperor, He treated them as if they were sand and soil and casually picked and destroyed them. In the end, he left behind a few martial arts that barely met the martial emperor's expectations. However, the complexity and difficulty of cultivating such a martial art were beyond imagination. It was impossible to cultivate unless one was a peerless martial arts genius. Even if it was a peerless martial arts genius, the speed at which their martial arts realm rose would be greatly slowed down. The speed at which their martial arts reached the peak would be delayed by who knows how many times. As expected, the martial emperor couldn't help but sigh, dispelling the idea of spreading such a martial art. After all, his mentality wasn't like Luo Fan's. After all, he was more concerned about the possibility and difficulty of raising martial arts to the highest realm, rather than shortening the gap between other auxiliary aspects of martial arts and other cultivation methods. Although this kind of refining method could eliminate the gap between martial arts and other cultivation methods in terms of auxiliary aspects, it would greatly slow down the speed of cultivation. In his opinion, such a method didn't have any value in spreading and promoting it. Naturally, Luo Fan didn't know that his refining would cause the martial emperor to think so. At this time, he was wholeheartedly focused on the two magic tools that had just taken shape. Although the two magic tools had already taken shape, they were still only magic tools with one layer of talismans. If he wanted to upgrade this magic tool to a magic treasure of the immortal level, he would need to refine it into at least 36 layers of talismans. This was the minimum requirement. If there was a need, this number could be increased to 72 or 108, but at most, it would be 108. And for every layer of talismans needed to be added to the magic tool, the number of talismans needed would increase exponentially. During this period, there was even some kind of invisible upgrade barrier that made it more difficult to upgrade the talisman layer of the magic tool. The talismans needed to upgrade the talisman layer of the magic tool were not difficult for Luo Fan. He only needed to think about it, and he could produce countless talismans. But the troublesome thing was the upgrade barrier when upgrading the talisman layer of the magic tool. These upgrade barriers weren't an obstacle that Luo Fan couldn't break through. But each upgrade barrier was different, and the method of breaking through was also different. If he wasn't careful, all his previous efforts could be wasted and the magic tool's foundation would be affected, causing the magic tool's chances of upgrading to a Primordial Daluo treasure in the future to be lowered. Primordial Daluo treasures were Great Perfection level magic treasures, and the 3 Great Perfection level magic treasures were just words. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan's ultimate goal was to upgrade these 2 magic tools to Great Perfection level magic treasures. Even if it wasn't difficult for him to upgrade the talisman layer of the magic tool, he needed to wholeheartedly control it without being distracted. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian and vote for me. The support of monthly votes is my greatest motivation. Chapter 821. Luo Fan sat cross-legged with his right hand stretched out. Endless runes were emitted from his palm, and like 2 torrents, they surged into the 2 pigeon egg-sized pills floating in front of him. Text first published, the 2 pills emitted a golden and dark red light. As countless runes surged into them, the light began to produce mysterious waves. The waves could not be described with words. They were full of a strange charm, as if some incredible existence was brewing in the 2 pills. However, the 2 pills didn't miss anything. They didn't even ripple as they absorbed the endless runes that surged into the 2 pills. They were like 2 tiny black holes. As the process went on, the runes on the 2 pills began to increase layer by layer. Every layer of runes on a celestial device would encounter some upgrade barriers, but they were only celestial devices after all. For Luo Fan, who had reached the Khanate Zenith Heaven realm, it was not difficult for him to break through such upgrade barriers as long as he knew the method to do so. Therefore, the speed of a rune's increase was as if the upgrade barriers did not exist. In just a few dozen days, the 2 celestial devices had been upgraded from the original 1 layer of runes to the realm of 36 layers of runes. When the runes on the celestial devices were upgraded to such a level, ordinary immortal level magic treasures could no longer be compared to them. In other words, although they were only celestial devices, the power of these two magic treasures was already so strong that ordinary immortal-level magic treasures could not resist them because they were made by Luo Fan. 36 layers of runes was not the limit of the number of runes on the celestial devices. However, there was no need to continue to increase the runes on the two celestial devices. Although the 36 layers of runes on the two celestial devices were enough to look down on ordinary immortal-level magic treasures, even if the runes on the two celestial devices continued to be upgraded to 108 layers, their power would at most be able to look down on more immortal-level magic treasures. They could not even be compared to the simplest pure Yang magic treasure. After all, the gap between pure Yang and immortal level was as big as the gap between the three realms of primordial unity and the three realms of earthly immortals. No matter how powerful a Dharma artifact was, it would not be able to withstand it. It was impossible to cross such a huge distance. In other words, the power of these two magic tools could be said to have reached a certain limit. There was not much meaning in increasing its power. Of course, if these two artifacts were prepared by Luo Fan himself, then the result would naturally be different. With his own artifacts, he would be able to increase its power a little. Even if the effort was not proportional to the reward, Luo Fan would definitely choose. But, obviously, this possibility does not exist. These two artifacts were merely crafted to complement Old Man Omniscient's plan, but he did not intend to use them in battle. Naturally, as long as they met the requirements and fulfilled their goals, it would be enough. There was no need for him to pay a disproportionate price for a slight increase in power. It was for these reasons. After refining these two magic artifacts into 36 layers of runes, Luo Fan began to upgrade these two magic artifacts to magic artifacts. Upgrading a magic tool to a magic treasure was a mysterious process. It was just like transforming a mortal into an immortal. It was by no means a simple matter, and it was not just a matter of inserting more runes. After making the decision, Luo Fan spread his hands apart and rested them on his knees. Then, with a thought, the two pigeon egg-sized pills slowly floated onto his palms. The two pills still looked the same as when he had just completed the first layer of runes, but the light they emitted was very different from before. The kind of golden light seemed to have become solid, even though it was illusory. Although it was illusory, it had a charm that could not be broken, as if it was some kind of physical substance that emitted golden light. At the same time, the dark red light also underwent a similar change. However, there were many sounds of battle mixed in it, as if weapons were clashing, as if power was colliding, and as if there were screams. The two pills floated above Luo Fan's palms. The light they emitted began to stretch and shrink, and in the process, it gradually became restrained. After a few hours, it had condensed into two fist-sized balls of light around the two pills. As it stretched and shrank, it seemed as if there was some kind of mystical creature breathing inside. At this moment, only less than 100 days had passed since Luo Fan began to refine these two magic tools. Compared to the 250,000 years it took to refine the treasure, this time was as short as a split second. However, this speed was already very slow for Luo Fan. After all, he had only completed 2 perfect magic tools. Just like cultivators, the speed at which an artifact became an immortal-grade magic treasure was also extremely fast. After all, there was no qualitative difference between the two. It was clear that if a cultivator could not complete the entire process quickly before attaining immortality, what awaited him would be the end of his lifespan, and his body would die. Similarly, just like the cultivation process of cultivators, the real time-consuming process was after attaining immortal level. Normally, after attaining immortal level, it would take tens of thousands of years for a cultivator to ascend to immortal level. Even among the Khanate Grand Luo cultivators on Earth right now, the fastest to become Incarnate Grand Luo would take tens of millions of years, while the slowest would take billions of years to achieve immortality. Compared to the hundreds, thousands, or at most tens of thousands of years before attaining immortality, there was a difference of millions of times. Those who took tens of millions of years to become incarnate Grand Luo would obviously not spend tens of thousands of years to achieve immortality. There is no difference in quality between the improvement of magic tools and the improvement of a cultivator's cultivation realm. Therefore, if an immortal-level magic tool wanted to ascend to the Khanate Grand Luo level, which was the Great Perfection level, it would obviously take millions of times more time than before attaining immortality. Even if magic tools were not limited by a cultivator's physical body, there would not be too much of a difference in the amount of time required. Based on this calculation, it was already slow for the two magic tools to reach the level of immortal-level magic tools after attaining immortal level. Luo Fan sat cross-legged with his hands spread flat on his knees. Power flowed within his body, naturally forming two different but equally filled with boundless vitality and an astonishing will. He guided them and gathered them on his hands, completely wrapping around the two pills. The process of turning magic tools into magic tools did not require power. It required opportunity. That was why it was impossible to pour power into the two magic tools in order to turn them into magic tools. Instead, it required the most perfect environment for living beings to be born. In other words, it had to be nurtured using the same method of creating living beings. What Luo Fan was doing at the moment was precisely such a process. After maintaining the power, the frequency at which the radiance around the two pills expanded and shrank seemed to have become even faster. The feeling that something mysterious was brewing within them became even stronger. It was obvious that Luo Fan's power, which contained boundless vitality and astonishing willpower, was inconceivably beneficial to these two magic tools. The process of turning magic tools into magic tools was extremely important, but Luo Fan was freed from it. That was because the process of nurturing was completely dependent on opportunity and time. Perhaps in the next instant, the two magic tools would transform and become immortal-level magic tools. Or perhaps it would take a long time for the same process to be completed. There was not much of a pattern to this, and it all depended on Luo Fan's luck. Evidently, it was. Luck was not under Luo Fan's control. Therefore, once the nurturing process began, there was nothing for him to do. Luo Fan relaxed and said to the martial emperor, who was watching from the side, "When these two magic tools will become magic tools will depend on luck. Perhaps it will be done in the next instant, or perhaps it will take several months. But no matter what, it will only take 10 months at most for the two magic tools to become magic tools. Fellow Taoist, your tool refinement skills are truly astonishing. I am far inferior to you." The martial emperor praised. The process of magic tools becoming magic tools depended on opportunity and luck. Both the martial emperor and Luo Fan knew this very well. However, even if they could not control the opportunity, controlling luck, but this process could not go against the laws of heaven and earth, nor could it go against the laws of the universe. With the power condensed on Luo Fan's hands, even if it was a stubborn stone, after staying there for 10 months, it would certainly give birth to some spirituality. What's more, these two magic tools had already reached a critical point where they could give birth to intelligence at any time. It's just a small trick. If you are willing, you can definitely do it easily. Luo Fan only smiled. When the martial emperor heard this, he smiled bitterly and said, "When I saw how profound your crafting was, I did try to deduce many martial arts of crafting, and some of them could barely achieve such an effect. However, none of those martial arts could be as easy as yours. Moreover, those martial arts are too complicated and have many restrictions. They're not things that ordinary martial artists can learn." After the martial emperor created many martial arts of crafting, he discovered the drawbacks of them. For a moment, he was quite depressed and couldn't help but talk about these troubles to Luo Fan. Luo Fan was also the only one in the entire universe who could listen to him and find a solution to his problems. When Luo Fan heard the martial emperor's words, he couldn't help but laugh and say, "Fellow is thinking too much. There are countless intelligent beings in the universe, and no two of them are exactly the same. Perhaps some living beings are suitable to cultivate the martial arts of crafting. You should know that not all living beings are suitable to cultivate the golden core Tao's pill refinement method. The martial emperor was slightly stunned and frowned in thought. After a while, he shook his head and said, "Even if they exist, the number is still too small. It is far less than the number of living beings that are suitable for crafting in other cultivation systems. There is still not much meaning in spreading it out." The martial emperor's mind was firm. Although he felt the same way as Luo Fan, when he saw how easily Luo Fan was forging, it was not so easy to change his mind after all. If Luo Fan did not show proof, he would not be able to change his mind. When Luo Fan saw the martial emperor's expression, he knew that his heart had already been shaken. At this moment, he was purposely bringing up such a topic to convince him. He could not help but smile, knowing that it was only a matter of time before the martial emperor changed his mind. Thus, he said, "One person is short, two people are long. Although my attainments in martial arts are not as good as yours, it is not inferior. Why don't fellow martial emperor show me the martial arts of crafting you deduced? Perhaps I can give you some suggestions." The martial emperor frowned and thought for a moment. He nodded and said, "Fine, since fellow has such intentions, I will not be polite anymore." As he spoke, he raised his hand and pointed. In an instant, countless characters condensed out of thin air and condensed into a series of mysterious martial arts in front of Luo Fan. These martial arts were completely condensed from martial intent. There was not a shred of vitality mixed in, and they were the embodiment of martial intent. Although each martial art was formed from words, they naturally displayed the true meaning of the martial arts they contained with the help of the martial intent, allowing any living beings who saw these words to easily understand the true meaning of the martial arts. They would not be shackled by the appearance. With a single thought, the martial emperor could create countless martial arts. At this moment, since he had the intention, the martial arts of crafting were endless. He created one after another, then threw them outside and displayed them in front of Luo Fan. Although Luo Fan was currently cultivating the two magic tools with his hands spread out, his mind was completely free, and he was not burdened by the two magic tools at all. His reaction speed was also extremely fast. With a single thought, he absorbed the martial arts displayed by the martial emperor into his mind and instantly analyzed them. He completely understood all the mysteries within and experienced the various advantages and disadvantages within. It had to be said that the martial emperor's attainments in martial arts had already reached a peak level. The countless martial arts he created were all indescribably exquisite, and in the outside world, they were definitely martial arts at the level of treasures. Even Luo Fan, when receiving these martial arts, needed to ponder and comprehend for a while before he could understand the deeper mysteries within and know the various advantages and disadvantages within. Looking at the countless martial arts, Luo Fan could not help but gradually feel admiration for the martial emperor. Among the countless methods of crafting the martial emperor had created, his application of martial arts had almost reached the acme of perfection. Among them, there were countless methods of crafting that Luo Fan had never thought of. The martial arts principles contained in these methods of crafting were all known to Luo Fan, and none of them surpassed Luo Fan in any way. However, combining these martial arts principles into a refining martial art and turning these martial arts knowledge into a practical refining method was something that Luo Fan had never thought of and was beyond his expectations. It could be said that, purely in terms of the application of martial arts, Luo Fan's attainments in martial arts were already not inferior to the martial emperors, but he was far behind. However, this was also the reason for his success, and this was also the reason for his failure. The martial emperor's application of martial arts had already reached the acme of perfection, which naturally allowed him to easily create countless kinds of crafting martial arts. However, it was also because he had already immersed the martial arts into the depths of his soul that he could already use martial arts to accomplish everything that could be imagined, which caused him to be involuntarily limited by martial arts. This limitation caused his way of thinking to be unable to transcend martial arts. He could not break away from the basic principles of martial arts to consider problems, so he could not look at the problem of crafting martial arts from the root of crafting. Crafting martial arts was to use a special method to fuse various materials together, and then add some special power, special principles, special rules, and special rules to it, thus giving it unimaginably mysterious power. Although such a process was not the process of creating things, it was not much different from creating things in terms of quality. It was just that it was much easier than creating things. The martial emperor could use martial arts to create such a world. He could transform a huge galaxy into a world that was like the legends of mortals, and he could even create living creatures on this planet that were most suitable for cultivating martial arts. How could his ability to create things be bad? In this way, under normal circumstances, it would naturally be a simple matter for the martial emperor to want to craft weapons, given his remarkable abilities and the power of his body. However, the martial emperor had encountered such great difficulties in crafting weapons, to the point that he could not even create martial arts that were suitable for cultivators to cultivate. How could this be impossible? The reason for this was actually very simple. Although the martial emperor had wholeheartedly cultivated martial arts, he had not formed his own worldview. He was still observing the universe according to the accepted worldview of Earth and the universe, and thinking about problems. As a result, his understanding of crafting weapons could not delve into the essence. Therefore, in the process of creating the martial art of weapon refinement, and even in the process of weapon refinement himself, he did not start from the root. Instead, he used his powerful divine abilities, his understanding of martial arts, and his superb mastery of martial arts to imitate the various aspects of the Golden Core Tao and the method of weapon refinement of the Golden Core Tao. Among the countless martial arts for crafting weapons created by the martial emperor that Luo Fan had received, most of them relied on martial arts to realize the various methods of crafting weapons in the Golden Core path. For example, using martial arts to complete rune weapon crafting methods, using martial arts to complete material fusion cultivation methods, and using martial arts to complete weapon crafting methods. Although these methods were mysterious and had an indescribable degree of compatibility with Earth and the universe, they were developed from the cultivation methods of the Golden Core path. After all, fundamentally, they were not compatible with martial arts. Under such circumstances, it would be strange if he could create a truly simple and easy-to-use martial arts for crafting weapons. To be continued. Chapter 822. The reason why Luo Fan could see this was not because Luo Fan's cultivation realm was much higher than martial emperor's, but because his knowledge of the nature of cultivation was stronger than martial emperor's. Text first. At this time, Luo Fan had already understood the essence of cultivation. He stood at a height that was countless times higher than a martial emperor and looked down on a martial emperor. Although in terms of cultivation realm, the difference between Luo Fan and a martial emperor was not obvious. Maybe Luo Fan's clone was slightly higher than a martial emperor, but it was still extremely limited. However, in terms of the understanding of the nature of cultivation, Luo Fan had already seen the way to the Tao Master level, or even the Sage level. All he needed to do was to follow the path that he saw and keep going. Martial Emperor, at this time, was shackled to his own realm and could not see his own future. Even if he wanted to make a little more progress, it was just an extravagant hope, a delusion. Such a gap in knowledge was enough to form such a gap in vision. It was enough for Luo Fan to see through the problem in an instant, but Martial Emperor had spent hundreds of millions of years and still could not see through it. Even if the solution to this problem was said by Luo Fan, it was only a kind of extremely simple and not difficult to do. So Martial Emperor felt that he should be able to think of it as long as he had a flash of inspiration. This could not change the fact that Martial Emperor had to spend more time and effort to solve this problem. Normally, it would be difficult for him to comprehend it on his own. Luo Fan naturally didn't think about why he could see through the problem so easily, while the Martial Emperor couldn't. After he understood the crux of the problem, he slightly shook his head and said, "Fellow Taoist, You don't have to continue. I already know the key to the problem, and I know how to solve it. When Martial Emperor heard this, he stopped the process of continuously creating refining martial arts. His eyes lit up and he said eagerly, I hope you can tell me. This matter is quite troublesome, but as long as you see this refining martial arts I created, you will know what is going on. Luo Fan faintly smiled and said, Then we will know what is going on. As he said this, he did not hesitate and moved his mind. The surrounding martial will naturally changed, condensing into a short but powerful text out of thin air. Although the martial will in this room had its own distinct characteristics and came from a martial emperor, Luo Fan's attainments in martial arts were not inferior to a martial emperor's. If the martial monarch did not stop him, it would not be difficult for him to control the martial will that was not restricted or fixed. It was obvious that the martial emperor was eager to know what exactly was going on with the weapon-refining martial art that Luo Fan had created. Just what kind of mysterious power did it possess? Just what kind of flaws did it have in the countless refining martial arts that he had created in the past half? How could it possibly stop Luo Fan from controlling this martial art and condensing it into words? It was precisely because of this that such a change occurred. As the words appeared one by one, the surrounding martial intent naturally began to fluctuate violently. The martial intent had been condensed by the martial emperor over countless years. It had long become an extremely mysterious existence, a mystical existence that was extremely compatible with the true intent of the martial art. When Luo Fan condensed the words with the help of the martial intent, his will naturally seeped into the martial intent. As a result, the martial intent naturally sensed the true intent hidden behind the words. It was the kind of martial arts that had almost reached the end and reached a dead end. The true meaning of martial arts that had opened up a new world instantly caused this martial arts will to surge. It caused a martial intent in the room to naturally condense into countless strange scenes. It was as if a living being's mind had suddenly become extremely turbulent, unable to calm down. However, no matter how the surrounding martial intent changed, the martial intent around Luo Fan and the martial emperor remained calm. It did not affect Luo Fan's method of condensing words with the martial intent at all. The martial art that Luo Fan had condensed was also a kind of refining martial art. Furthermore, it was the simplest kind of refining martial art that could only refine one type of weapon with extremely limited power. What it described was a kind of ordinary material that was continuously infused with martial intent. In the end, the material would gradually change, and in the end, it would possess a refining method with a special function. In reality, this kind of martial art wasn't very profound. The power of the artifact refined was only average. At most, it could give the material some special functions of the martial arts will. It could give the user some help in battle and allow the user to enter the martial art state more easily during cultivation. Compared to the countless blacksmithing martial arts created by the martial monarch, this was much better. Even if it was compared to the worst kind, the refined product would be countless times worse. However, the martial emperor felt as if he had been struck by lightning. He sat there in a daze as he muttered, So that's how it is. At this moment, the boundless martial power in his body surged violently. His mind that was originally like a pool of stagnant water instantly became extremely excited. He even felt that his cultivation realm, which had not moved for a long time, seemed to show signs of rising slightly. It was as if the bottleneck that had shackled him for hundreds of millions of years had been broken in an instant. The martial emperor was able to rely on a martial art that others did not think highly of to cultivate to such a supreme level. One could imagine how great his mind was. Although Luo Fan had only displayed a mediocre refining martial art that could only refine an extremely ordinary weapon, it had already allowed him to instantly understand the meaning that Luo Fan wanted to express, and he had also realized the real drawbacks of the countless refining martial arts that he had created. No wonder no matter how I can't create a martial art that can truly compare to other refining methods. It turns out that my goal is incompatible with martial arts. The artifacts I want to use martial arts to refine are artifacts that are not compatible with martial arts. At this moment, such a thought flashed through the martial emperor's mind. A look of ecstasy gradually appeared on his face. With a slight thought, countless words and diagrams condensed in his mind in an instant. Martial arts that were countless times more profound than the one that Luo Fan had condensed were continuously created by him. Every single one of them was an indescribably profound blacksmithing technique. Every single one of them described an unimaginably profound blacksmithing technique that could be used to refine certain types of items that possess supreme power. Every single one of these items possessed unbelievable power. However, they were qualitatively different from regular magic tools and arcane treasures. They could not even be called magic tools or arcane treasures anymore. Perhaps there were only two terms that could describe their qualities: weapons and martial treasures. These weapons were naturally not ordinary weapons like the sabers, spears, swords, and halberds in the mortal world. Instead, they were weapons that were comparable in power to magic tools. However, in terms of quality, they were completely in the category of martial arts. They relied entirely on martial arts willpower, and only martial arts. It was a mysterious artifact that was refined by relying on the will of martial arts. As for martial treasures, they corresponded to magical treasures. They were the next step of weapons. Its power was not inferior to that of a transcendent artifact, but the forging method relied on martial arts and martial arts will, and could only rely on martial arts and martial arts will. When these countless martial arts were created, the martial emperor felt extremely satisfied. He instantly felt an indescribable joy from the bottom of his heart, instantly filling his mind. It filled his entire body. The great Tao of martial arts has been completed. Under that hearty joy, the martial emperor laughed loudly and let out a long howl. It was a long roar. It instantly spread out of the training room, out of the war god peak, and spread throughout the entire planet that had been refined by the martial emperor. It was countless times larger than a normal planet, and it even spread out further. It spread throughout the entire star system, affecting a radius of several light years. Fortunately, there were no other planets with life within a radius of several light years, nor were there any other cultivators cultivating there. As such, this did not affect too many living beings. After the long howl, the martial emperor raised his hand and waved. From a storeroom that Luo Fan and the martial emperor had entered once before, hundreds of materials appeared out of thin air before him. His boundless martial arts willpower suddenly poured in, and the hundreds of materials instantly collapsed, then suddenly merged together, condensing into the shape of a thick book in the air. This book looked extremely simple and unadorned, yet it was extremely concise. It gave off a martial arts willpower that encompassed everything, as if it was an intelligent cultivator who knew everything and embraced everything. At that moment, the martial emperor did not stop. Instead, he continued to pour his martial arts willpower into the book. Of course, the process was only seen by the outside world. In reality, the entire process contained countless marvelous techniques and unimaginable martial arts principles. Just like the first time, there were countless unimaginable and complicated changes taking place after he poured it in for the first time. As a martial arts willpower poured in, the book gradually changed. The martial arts willpower it gave off grew stronger, and when it reached a certain limit, it suddenly changed. It went from strengthening to withdrawing, making the book seem like an ordinary book. However, this was only at a glance. If one took a closer look, they would discover that the book seemed a little illusory, as if it was a book that no living being could grasp and no existence could see through. Luo Fan's eyesight was quite shocking, and he could see many mysteries hidden behind it. This book was none other than the very first martial treasure in the universe on Earth. At that moment, all the martial arts willpower within it had condensed into something similar to a treasure spirit. It possessed some sort of supreme intelligence, as well as an indescribable consciousness that was similar to the consciousness of a living being. If one had to give a name, then it would be the martial spirit of the martial treasure. Obviously, the martial emperor's actions just now had directly verified his comprehension and verified if the numerous weapon refinement martial arts that he had created would work. When the changes were complete, the martial emperor stopped pouring his martial arts willpower into the book, and a carefree expression appeared on his face. He raised his hand and pointed. In that instant, countless pieces of information were poured into the book. There was a huge amount of information, which contained the countless martial arts that the martial emperor had created. They were not the martial arts that were used to refine arcane tools or artifacts, but martial arts that were used to refine weapons and martial treasures. These martial arts came from the martial emperor, who was regarded as the greatest martial arts in the entire universe. Their profundity surpassed any martial arts that could be created by any living being in the universe. It could be said that they were the truth-level textbooks on how to refine weapons and martial treasures in the universe. The entire process of pouring information into the book lasted for more than 10 hours. During that time, the martial emperor was creating martial arts at every moment. Various martial arts were being created at every moment, which were then turned into information and poured into the first martial treasure that had existed in the universe for hundreds of millions of years. After more than 10 hours, when the martial emperor finally stopped pouring information into the book, the number of martial arts that were recorded in the martial treasure had reached a shocking number of hundreds of millions. Almost all the martial emperors knew about this number. Everything that they could think of, including the construction and refining methods of weapons and martial treasures, were included in the book. It could be said that at that moment, the martial arts that the martial emperor had created were similar to the martial arts recorded in the martial treasure, or their origins. At that moment, on the cover of the martial treasure that looked like a book, there were 3 bold and flamboyant words that gave off an indescribable feeling, as if one had stepped into some sort of mysterious martial state. Martial Treasure Scripture. When all the changes were completed, the illusionary figure of an old man appeared on the martial treasure scripture. The old man had a peaceful face, but his eyes were like 2 universes, like 2 deep pools. It was as if countless martial arts were being born and destroyed in them. His entire body, every part of his body, was in line with the principles of martial arts, containing countless mysteries of martial arts. After the illusionary figure of the old man appeared, he bowed at the martial emperor. Then he bowed at Luo Fan. After that, with a shake of his body, he instantly disappeared into the martial treasure scripture. Following that, the martial treasure scripture shuddered and suddenly split into different parts. They looked exactly the same as the martial treasure scripture, but there were a few more words on the cover. They turned into an invisible current that rushed out of the training room, out of the martial god peak, or into the ground of the planet. Or they would rush out of this star system, out of this world, and head into the boundless universe. The extra words on the cover of the separated parts were not something else, but a certain volume. For example, the soul-stealing whip volume, the silken sword volume, etc. Among them, each of the parts recorded a martial art that could be used to refine weapons or martial treasures. When Luo Fan saw what the martial emperor was doing, he smiled. He knew that these were the seeds of martial arts in the universe on Earth. As long as these parts were discovered by the living beings in the universe on Earth, the prosperity of martial arts could be predicted. The martial treasure scripture had split into hundreds of millions of parts. After the hundreds of millions of parts were split, the body of the martial treasure scripture became faintly discernible, illusory, and real. It seemed like it could collapse and dissipate at any time. After all, the martial treasure scripture was something that had just been refined into a martial treasure. Its level was only equivalent to an immortal grade artifact. Even if the power of the body was mysterious and unique, it was not easy for it to split into hundreds of millions of parts, and it was impossible for it to be completely unharmed. Such a change was clearly a sign that it had suffered great damage and was on the verge of collapsing and degenerating into a weapon. The martial emperor had already expected this, so he did not hesitate. With a thought, he summoned several hundred more materials from his storeroom. With his martial intent, all the materials disintegrated into fine powder, which was sent into the scripture of martial treasure, allowing the scripture of martial treasure to quickly stabilize. It broke free from its incorporeal state and regained its physical form. The martial emperor had refined it again, stabilizing it at the level of a martial treasure. Although the concept of weapons and martial treasures had only just been formed by the martial emperor under Luo Fan's awakening, with the martial emperor's unimaginable attainments in martial arts, he had long perfected the grading system for weapons and martial treasures. The grades of weapons corresponded to artifacts, and their power was also divided into a few grades, corresponding to the power of the artifacts with different runes. The grades of martial treasures corresponded to artifacts, and there were also Immortal Grade, Purion Grade, and Peak Grade. Of course, there was an even higher Sage Grade, but it would not require the martial emperor, who was only an innate zenith heavenly realm, to create a Sage Grade refining method for martial treasures. The martial treasure scripture was a martial treasure that had never appeared in the Earth's universe, and the refining method was also unprecedented. However, it could not ignore the laws of the Earth's universe, nor could it directly transcend time. It was impossible for it to break through the Immortal Grade and reach the Purion Grade as soon as it was refined. Therefore, even with the martial emperor here and the support of countless materials, the martial treasure scripture was still only at the Immortal Grade. If it wanted to truly rise to the Purion Grade, to rise to the Peak Grade similar to a Daluo heavenly treasure, it would take a long time to refine it and the martial emperor to expend endless energy. Moreover, the martial treasure scripture had split into hundreds of millions of parts and was sent to various places in the Earth's universe, so it would definitely take a long time to refine it. At that moment, the martial treasure scripture trembled slightly and suddenly split into another part. It rushed out of the cultivation room, out of the galaxy, and into the boundless void of the universe. When Luo Fan saw the change, he secretly praised the martial emperor's perfect preparation. The reason why the martial treasure scripture split again was because one of the hundreds of millions of parts that the martial treasure scripture had split into had encountered some harsh environment or was destroyed by some attack. Naturally, the martial treasure scripture would split into another part and send it out again to ensure that the martial arts recorded in the parts of the martial treasure scripture would be complete. To be continued.